The first story you'll hear is called A Father's Love, and it's about how one father can swap out their cat for an identical-looking. In January of 2015, a 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's family was totally devastated by this news. In fact, George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. And so in his father's absence, George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He did not believe his son was just totally brain dead and there was no hope. He felt like they should at least try to give him a little bit more time to potentially give them a signal that he was okay. But George's mother and brother told George's father that they had spoken to the doctors and there was just no hope. There was no reason to delay this process. It was time. But George's father was totally not having it. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that. And in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs, that are waiting for this organ transplant. And so really what we need to do is actually expedite taking him off of life support because that's the best thing to do right now. George's father was so upset, totally distraught. He ran back to his son's room. He laid over his son and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't. And before long, the doctors began filtering into the room to begin the procedure of removing his son from life support. And when they came in the room, George's father kind of snapped. He ran out of the room, he ran out of the hospital, he went out to his car and he got his gun and then ran back into the hospital, back into his son's room and aimed the gun at the doctors and ordered them to stop what they were doing and leave the room immediately. And so the doctors had not actually begun removing George from life support, so he's still on life support. And so once the doctors and everyone left the room, George's father walked over, he locked the door, and then for the next several hours, he just kept his gun aimed at the door as he laid over his son and just kept looking down in hopes that his son would give him some sign that he was not brain dead. And so finally, when the SWAT team arrived and was stacking up outside the door in the hallway, they began yelling into the room for George's father to put the gun down and let them come in. And George's father the whole time is just looking down at his son, hoping and praying that his son is just going to do something. And right as the SWAT team kicks in the door and comes into the room, George's father had reached down and grabbed his son's hand, and his son squeezed his hand back. And as soon as his father felt that, he dropped the gun and he surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. And then the SWAT team put George's father on the ground. And as he's being detained, George's father is yelling for the doctors to come in the room. My son is okay. And sure enough, when the doctors came in the room, George was okay. He was moving his hand, his eyes were open, he was making good eye contact. And before long, he made a totally full recovery. He would later be told that had his father not stepped in when he did and bought him those extra few hours on life support, George would have died. As for George's father, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison for his aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but he and the rest of his family think what he did was certainly worth going to prison for. Our next story is called Transplant. When Conrad Rowland was a little kid, he was always on the go. One time when he was at the grocery store with his mother, he leapt out of the cart and ran away from her, and she found him stuck inside of a freezer. After that incident, she literally made him wear bells on his shoes when they were out in public so she didn't lose track of him. But by the time Conrad was just 4 years old, he had discovered athletics. And instead of putting his energy into running away from his mom, he focused it exclusively on baseball, basketball, soccer, and tennis. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was an exceptional all-around athlete. And at the time, his school announced they were going to have the special guest speaker at an assembly, and it turned out to be the Hall of Fame baseball player Rod Carew. And Conrad was just blown away. He just could not believe he was in the presence of an actual professional athlete, let alone a guy that had achieved the success Rod Carew had. And so after this assembly, when he got home, it was all Conrad could talk about, was just how incredible Mr. Carew was and how he, Conrad, was gonna be a professional athlete just like Mr. Carew. For many kids, this would just be a phase. They'd be really invested in sports, and then their interest would go somewhere else, and they'd kind of forget about it, and it would not be their life calling anymore. But for Conrad, the impression Rod Carew left on him was so profound that he never wavered. He really did dedicate himself to becoming a professional athlete, and he would be successful. Albeit in a different sport, he became a professional football player in the NFL. And in 2012, Conrad started nearly every game for the New York Jets at tight end. It was like his professional career was going off without a hitch. But in 2013, he injured his knee, which sidelined him for about 2 years. And even though he diligently rehabbed and got back to full strength, the teams were not really ready to take a flyer on him because they were worried his knee would just give out again. He continued to train extremely hard in hopes of landing another contract, but his playing career was starting to look bleak. During the 2016 offseason, Conrad was back home in California visiting his family. One night, as his mother, Mary, was making dinner, Conrad was sitting at the table filling out his driver's license renewal form. And when he got to the section where it asked him if he wanted to be an organ donor, he stopped and he asked his mother, are you an organ donor? And she would say, yeah, I am. And so Conrad said, okay, then I will be too. And he checked the box. And Mary remembers thinking, gosh, I really hope it never comes to that. A few months later, Conrad was working out in a local gym getting ready for the next season when he developed a sudden and severely painful headache. He tried to keep working out, but he just could not do it. So he stepped aside and he called his mom and he told her that he felt this weird click in his head and then he felt this blinding pain behind his left eye. His mother told him he needed to go to the hospital right away. And so that day, Conrad went over to the UCLA Medical Center where they quickly diagnosed him with a brain aneurysm. A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain. If the aneurysm bursts, it's fatal about 50% of the time. And for the people who survive a ruptured aneurysm, most likely they will suffer from significant neurological deficits. After his diagnosis, Conrad remained positive and assured his family he was going to kick this thing's butt. But on December 12th, just 4 days after he was admitted, Conrad's aneurysm burst and he never regained consciousness. Because Conrad was an organ donor, the doctors kept his body on life support and they called the recipients at the top of the donor lists. One of them was a man in his 70s who a year earlier had suffered a massive heart attack and desperately needed a new heart. When he and his wife got the call, they were shaking. They couldn't believe it. His life was about to be saved. They already lived right near Los Angeles, so they hopped in their car and they sped to the UCLA Medical Center, and shortly thereafter, news out of the operating room was the transplant had been a success. The man Conrad's heart had just saved was none other than Baseball Hall of Famer Rod Carew, Conrad's childhood hero that had pushed him to become a professional athlete. At first, the families had no idea, but eventually this incredible link was discovered and immediately the two families bonded. Today, because Conrad's family only lives 12 miles away from Rod Carew and his family, Conrad's mother was given a standing invitation by the Carews to stop by anytime she wanted to listen to her son's heart.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Maneuver.
On the morning of August 1st, 2009, 44-year-old skydiving instructor David Hartsock pulled into the parking lot of Skydive Houston in Texas and then made his way inside. A few minutes later, and Dave, like the rest of his colleagues, was hard at work getting ready for the day before the facility opened up and the inevitable weekend rush began. Skydive Houston is actually just a private airport, and it's not really in Houston. It's located about 30 miles to the northwest of Houston in a city called Waller. The main facility of Skydive Houston is situated right up against this huge open airfield that basically looks like a big green grass field. And the main facility itself is comprised of several large buildings, one of which is a huge hangar that contains the Super Twin Otter airplanes, which are the little aircraft that bring the skydivers up so they can jump out. Because Skydive Houston offers something called tandem jumping, it gets a lot of first-time jumpers. Tandem jumping is when a skydiving student attaches to the front of their instructor. Literally, they're buckled onto them, and then the two of them leap out of the plane together, with the student never detaching from the instructor. This method allows the student to just kind of go along for the ride and have no responsibility, while the instructor who's attached to them does everything. They make sure they're both stable in the air, they're the ones that pull the ripcord to deploy the chute, they're the ones that land them safely on the ground. And so obviously, tandem jumping really appeals to first-time jumpers. Dave had finished his 3-year-long training course to become a certified skydiving instructor just a few months earlier. But even prior to going through this course, Dave was already a very experienced skydiver with over 800 jumps to his credit. And the reason he had so many jumps is because Dave loved skydiving. It had given his life a focus that really nothing else ever had. Dave had always been a kind of average guy. He lived in a very modest house in a suburb of Houston, and for much of his life, he had worked very normal blue-collar jobs, like he had been a cook at 2 different chain restaurants, he had managed a grocery store, and he also had worked at a soda bottling plant. Dave was divorced and had no kids, but he had a really good group of friends who liked to go to bars and go bowling and play darts. And while Dave was never really unhappy with the way his life was going, as he started to creep into his 40s, he couldn't help but think, I haven't really done anything big or important in my life. And so, in 2004, not long after Dave got divorced, one of his good friends asked him if he wanted to go skydiving with him to celebrate that friend's 40th birthday. And Dave immediately thought to himself, this is it. This is a chance to do something big with my life. And so he told the friend, yes, I'd love to go. And after that first jump that Dave did with his friend, Dave was hooked. Whenever Dave was falling through the sky at over 100 miles per hour, it was like nothing else in the whole world even existed. Life became very simple and beautiful. The manager at Skydive Houston saw Dave come in every weekend for years to do all these jumps, and finally, he just offered Dave a job. And so that was how Dave left the soda bottling plant to become a skydiving instructor. So, August 1st, 2009 was a Saturday, and Saturdays at Skydive Houston were incredibly busy with basically non-stop tandem jumps all day. Whenever Dave was not working, so he was jumping on his own, he would always pack his own parachute because, like many other skydivers, he liked to make sure it was done exactly right. But when Dave was working, especially on Saturdays when it was so crazy busy, he didn't have time to pack and repack his parachute after every single jump because he was constantly being sent up again and again and again to take another student. And so instead, he would take one of the pre-packed parachutes that were left out for instructors inside of their clubhouse. That particular Saturday in August of 2009 went very quickly, with Dave going up one after another with different students and jumping out and pulling the chute and landing safely over and over again. And then finally, at the end of the day, right around 4 o'clock, when Dave was getting ready to be done for the day, his manager came up to him and said, "Hey, do you mind doing one more tandem jump?" And even though Dave was really exhausted, he's dripping sweat, it's super hot outside, he'd done 6 jumps that day, which was a lot, he said, "No problem." And so the manager introduced Dave to a short blonde woman who was visibly nervous named Shirley Diggert, who was there to celebrate her 54th birthday by skydiving for the first time. Her husband, her son, and her 3 grandkids were also there to watch her from the ground and take pictures, and her other son, who was celebrating his 30th birthday, he too was going skydiving. As soon as Dave walked up to Shirley, he grinned and stuck out his hand, and he made the same kind of corny joke he always made with nervous first-time jumpers, and that was, "Don't worry, you're going to be just fine. You're going to be strapped to me, and I'm not about to let anything happen to myself." And so Shirley laughed, and she did seem like she was a little bit at ease, and so Dave patted her on the shoulder, and then he walked over and he grabbed one of the pre-packed parachutes off the wall. These chutes actually contained 2 parachutes inside of the backpack. There was the main chute, which typically is the only chute that gets deployed on a jump, and then there was the reserve chute, which is a little bit smaller and is not normally used unless there's some sort of emergency where the main chute fails. After every jump, because the main chute has been deployed, it gets repacked and stuffed back into the backpack. But the reserve chute, because it almost never gets deployed, just stays packed. And so Skydive Houston, like basically every other skydiving facility, has certified technicians come in periodically to test the reserve chutes inside of the bag to make sure they're still packed exactly right. After grabbing the pre-packed parachute off the wall, Dave walked back over to Shirley, who was now in the staging area putting on her flight suit. A flight suit is a single garment, kind of looks like a big onesie for an adult. And so Dave walked over, he put the parachute down, he tugged and pulled on her flight suit to make sure it was good, and then after he was satisfied, he picked the parachute back up and he signaled to Shirley, as well as Shirley's son, who was also skydiving, to follow him. And so the trio, they left the staging area, they went outside right to the airfield where there was a Super Twin Otter idling and other jumpers were climbing on board to go for a jump. And so Dave, Shirley, and Shirley's son got in line, they boarded the plane, and a few minutes later, they were airborne. As the plane slowly climbed up to 13,500 feet, which is the jumping altitude, Shirley was sitting directly in front of Dave. They were on a bench seat on the back right of this little airplane, and Dave made a point of talking to Shirley and asking her where she was from and what she did to kind of ease her nerves. Shirley would tell Dave that this was not the kind of thing that she typically did. In fact, she told Dave that her other son, who was jumping with them, when he first decided he wanted to try skydiving a year earlier, she had desperately tried to talk him out of it, saying it was too dangerous. But recently, Shirley and her husband had decided that they needed to be more adventurous. They lived in a quiet town in rural Texas where Shirley was a mail carrier and her husband worked in a mine, and their lives were just kind of simple and very routine-oriented and kind of boring. So when Shirley's son, who was skydiving with them that day, had asked Shirley to go skydiving on her 54th birthday, she saw it as an opportunity to break the mold and do something adventurous, and so she said yes. And so Dave told Shirley about how he had discovered skydiving much the same way she had, and they really bonded over that. About 20 minutes after takeoff, all the tandem jumpers on the plane were now attached to their instructors, so Shirley was now buckled onto Dave. And then when they reached 13,500 feet, the jumping altitude, one of the instructors slid open the side door. It was time to jump. And the first one who was jumping was Shirley's son. And so from all the way back in the plane, Shirley called out to her son, "Have a good jump, I'll see you on the ground," as her son kind of waddled to the edge of the door with his instructor, and the two of them jumped out and disappeared into the air below. Next up was Shirley. So Dave told Shirley very calmly to stand up, and so they did. They stood up right next to their bench, and then before they waddled towards the exit, Dave, for what felt like the millionth time, checked to make sure he really was securely fastened onto Shirley, and then Dave tapped his ripcord right behind him, kind of like muscle memory, reminding himself where to go. He tapped his knife on his shoulder. He kind of just felt his equipment, and then feeling ready, he said, "Okay, Shirley, let's go." And then the two of them kind of waddled their way towards the front of the plane where that door was slid wide open, and then they turned, so Shirley's feet were right on the edge, basically looking out into the sky right outside. And so it's really loud, it's very windy, and Dave is right in Shirley's ear saying, "Okay, I'm gonna count to 3 and we're gonna jump." And then Dave reached forward, he pulled Shirley's head back so she was looking up because he didn't want her to look down when they leapt out, because for some people that will cause them to panic when they see the ground. And so with Shirley's head back, Dave very calmly said 1, 2, 3, and then very gracefully, the two of them jumped out. From the moment you jump out of a plane at 13,500 feet until you touch the ground, it takes maybe 2 to 3 minutes with about 30 seconds to a minute of actual freefall. But that 2 to 3 minutes is so intense, it feels like it's 20 minutes long. And this was what Dave loved so much about skydiving, that intense presence you feel, that you're really in the moment. There's nothing else you can think about. It's just you careening through the sky towards the earth. It's incredible. Dave had actually had a number of close calls in his life. Like a few years earlier, he had been riding his motorcycle when somebody hit him in their car and he fractured his skull. And then not long after that accident, he was in another accident where he fractured his spine. And after each of those two accidents and a few others, the only thought in Dave's mind was, oh my goodness, I hope I can skydive again. And miraculously, he had been. He had made full recoveries and he was back to skydiving each time. And so now, whenever he jumped out of a plane, he just felt so lucky. The plan for that evening's jump was for Dave to rotate them 360 degrees 3 separate times so Shirley could get a full look down across Houston and all over Texas and just kind of see the world around her from so high up in the air. And then, whenever Dave noticed that they were at 5,000 feet using his wrist altimeter, which is basically like a watch that tells you how far you are from the ground, Dave would pull the ripcord, the main chute would deploy, and they would float gently down to the ground. And at first, that is how this jump went. After they exited the plane, they stabilized in the proper horizontal position with Shirley in front, her stomach pointing toward the ground, and Dave obviously right behind her, controlling the skydive. And then after a few seconds, Dave slightly changed his body position and began rotating them 360 degrees so Shirley could look down and see all the highways and cars and barns and houses and the city off in the distance. I mean, it's this spectacular view. And as you're falling through the sky, especially in the first few seconds of a jump, you can't tell that you're going super fast, but you're going over 120 miles an hour, which is called terminal velocity. It's literally the fastest you can fall in the air. And so you're blazing towards the ground, but it almost feels like the air is pushing you back up. And so Shirley's having this incredible first-time experience, just really taking it all in. And Dave, even though he had done this hundreds of times, was having a wonderful time as well. But Dave really was just focused on his altimeter, because when they hit 5,000 feet, he needed to pull the parachute. And so they're cruising along, Dave's checking his altimeter over and over again, and then finally he sees 5,000 feet, he quickly looks around him to scan for any other jumpers, he's clear, and so he reached back and he pulled his ripcord handle for his main chute. Now, normally, when you deploy your main parachute, depending on what kind of parachute you're using, there's actually kind of a slow unfurling. It's not like suddenly the chute is deployed and then you just stop. That would not work. You'd get destroyed every time you skydive. So the way it's packed is it kind of unfurls slowly, and it's like a gradual slowing down. But after Dave has pulled the ripcord handle, there was an immediate yank of the parachute backpack up and away from him, and then from somewhere above him, he heard a loud popping sound. Now, Dave had jumped enough times to know that this was not normal. There was a problem, and he would be right. The main parachute had deployed out of the backpack, but it got tangled on the way out, and so it did not inflate at all, and so as a result, it was not slowing them down at all. But worse than that was this tangled up parachute was still attached to them, and it kind of became like a sail. And it turned Dave and Shirley onto their sides and began whipping them around in something called a death spiral, where literally you're just spinning so unbelievably fast that normally jumpers will actually lose consciousness. They're spinning so fast. But Dave, being a very experienced skydiver, he tried to stay calm. He tried to track his way out of this death spiral, which is when you put your arms and legs straight and try to go in a straight line through the air. But it didn't work. He just kept on spinning faster and faster. And at this point, Shirley, she's practically losing consciousness. She's yelling what's going on. And Dave is just trying to stay calm. He's still trying to get out of it, but he knows there's no way. But Dave remembers he has 2 knives. And so he decides he's going to cut away this tangled main chute and then deploy his reserve chute, because you don't want to open your reserve directly into a tangled parachute. And so he reaches up, he's spinning, remember, he reaches up and he grabs the first knife. However, the lines of the tangled parachute had actually tangled on his shoulder strap where that first knife was. And so he literally couldn't get to the knife. And so now they're below 5,000 feet. They're at like 4,000, closing in on 3,000 feet. I mean, they're coming close to the ground here, and they don't have a canopy. But Dave, he stays calm. They're spinning around. He can't get that first knife. And so he reaches for the second knife, which was placed in front of Shirley. But because of how quickly they were spinning, he couldn't quite get his arm out to grab the second knife. It was just impossible to grab it. And so, without any other options, Dave had to pull his reserve chute, knowing it was going to go straight into this tangled mess right above them. And so the reserve chute, it deploys, and it does work, at least at first. There's that gradual slowing down sensation that Dave immediately feels. Their spin begins to stop, and for a second, it seems like they're going to be saved by this reserve chute, because by now they're only about 2,000 feet from the ground. However, the worst case scenario happens to Dave and Shirley. As soon as their reserve chute was up over their head, inflated, their main chute suddenly caught air and inflated as well. So they had 2 parachutes. Now, you can land with 2 parachutes, absolutely. However, sometimes in a worst case scenario, the 2 parachutes will catch wind going in opposite directions. So basically the parachutes will go out to either side of the jumper or jumpers if it's tandem. And then you basically have wings that aim the jumpers straight at the ground. It's like an accelerant. It causes them to literally speed up straight towards the ground. And once you start moving in this position, which is known as a down plane, it's almost impossible to get out of it because the faster you go, the more inflated these 2 parachutes become. And so Dave knows they are less than 2,000 feet from the ground. They're in a down plane, which is almost always fatal. And so all he can do is try to get out of the down plane. And so Dave, with all his might, he begins yanking on the different lines of both parachutes, and he manages to get them out of the downplane, which is nearly impossible to do. He does it. And then both parachutes collapse. And suddenly, Dave and Shirley have no parachute, they're less than 1,000 feet from the ground, and they are falling once again over 100 miles per hour straight down to the earth. Now, at this moment, Shirley is crying, she's screaming, she doesn't know what's going on, and Dave has this incredible sense of calm come over him. Years ago, Dave had given up on the idea of ever having a family or of having kids. He was a really good guy who would have been a great father, but it just wasn't in the cards for him. Instead, Dave had found skydiving. Oftentimes, Dave would stay late at Skydive Houston and just sit around the campfire with the other instructors and the other jumpers and drink beers and eat burgers and tell stories. And sometimes Dave would even sleep the night at Skydive Houston because he didn't want to go back home to his empty 3-bedroom house where all he wanted to do when he was there was go skydiving again. But now, literally staring down his own death, knowing that it's going to happen any second, the only thing he could think about was Shirley. He didn't care if he died. He felt like he had found his calling. If he died doing it, so be it. But Shirley, her husband, her son on the ground, her son skydiving, her 3 grandkids, they're going to see Shirley hit the ground and die. He just couldn't handle it. He thought, I have to do something to protect Shirley. And with only a few hundred feet to the ground, Dave yelled to Shirley, "Tuck your knees up." And Shirley immediately did it. She threw her knees up, and as she did, Dave pulled back as hard as he possibly could on the risers and the toggles in an attempt to switch places with Shirley. Shirley was in front of him. Her body's going to hit the ground first. Dave flipped them around so that his back was going to hit the ground first. He was going to sacrifice himself to maybe save Shirley. When they hit the ground, people a quarter mile away heard their impact. And when they hit the ground, all of Shirley's family saw it. Everybody saw it. They went running over to the crash site. And when they got there, there was this tangle of bodies and this parachute. And as they're staring at it, they watched one of the bodies move. It was Shirley. She was alive. After paramedics arrived, they cut her off of Dave's body and they rushed her to the hospital where she had serious injuries, several broken vertebrae, and very significant internal injuries, but none of them were life-threatening. She would survive. However, 3 days after arriving in the hospital, Shirley got devastating news. Dave had been rushed to the hospital as well right after Shirley had, but he finally had succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Dave's last-ditch maneuver had worked. He had saved Shirley's life at the cost of his own. However, not long after Shirley and her family found out about Dave's death, they got another call, and this time it was to tell them that the news about Dave's death was premature. He was not dead. However, he was paralyzed from the neck down. A few weeks later, after Shirley got out of the hospital, she immediately went to the intensive care unit where Dave was being treated to see him for the first time since their accident. And when she saw him, he was sitting in a wheelchair covered in tubes and wires, and she just stood there looking at him, and Dave, when he saw Shirley, he just started to cry. At this point, Shirley walked up to him, she gave him a hug, and she said, "I love you." Today, Dave and Shirley are still friends. Shirley has recovered completely because of Dave's heroic act. Dave, on the other hand, remains paralyzed and only has a little bit of feeling in his right arm. He now lives in Texas with his mother, who looks after him full-time, and they desperately need our support. My family has already made a donation to his GoFundMe page, and I hope some of you will do the same thing. You can find his GoFundMe page in the description below. When his family moved from Louisiana to an area of Los Angeles, California called South Central. When the Coles arrived in 1985, South Central, which had a population of 500,000 people, was seeing a huge uptick in gang violence and drug dealing. But by the time Reggie, the youngest of the 5 Cole children, had turned 10 years old, the family had managed to move from an apartment on 98th Street in one of the most dangerous areas of South Central to 71st Street, one of the few somewhat safe neighborhoods in the area. They lived in a small tan bungalow that had a neat front yard that was bordered by rose bushes and shaded by palm and eucalyptus trees. Reggie's mother was a deeply religious woman. She made sure all of her children attended the local Missionary Baptist church every Sunday. She was also strict and told her 2 daughters and 3 sons that they had to be inside the house every night before the streetlights came on. Reggie's stepfather, who had raised the Cole kids as if they were his own, worked in an aluminum factory. He was from a small town in Louisiana, and in their new South Central neighborhood, he became known for his soul food. On Sundays, the Cole children always looked forward to a big meal of red beans, rice, black-eyed peas, and collards. But for one of the Cole children, the middle son named Kenny, home was not on 71st Street. For him, home was the old neighborhood where the family had lived on 98th Street, where Kenny was part of a violent gang called 9 Deuce Hoover Crips. And when Kenny was 15 and Reggie was 10, Kenny was killed in that old neighborhood in a drive-by shooting. His killer was never caught. Reggie was devastated. Always small and skinny, he had idolized his older brother, and Kenny had always protected Reggie from neighborhood bullies. For a while after the murder of his brother, Reggie continued to do well in school. He got good marks in junior high and joined his other brother as an usher in church on Sundays, and he kept up with school social events, playing basketball and attending his junior high prom. But by the time Reggie was 2 years into high school, all that had changed. Reggie, who had inherited his deceased brother's friends and gang affiliations from the old neighborhood, was gradually sinking deeper and deeper into gang life. Because of his goofy attitude, Reggie became known to his brother's friends as Gumby. Although he still lived at home with his mom, Reggie had moved out of her house and into a shed in her backyard. His family called him Reggie, but now he preferred his street name, Gumby. And he'd started dressing down, which meant wearing the oversized jogging suits and sports apparel and expensive sneakers that marked him as a gang member. Then, in his senior year, he dropped out of high school, and at the same time, his mom and stepfather separated. Once he was out of school, Reggie spent all of his time on the streets, or in his shed, where the walls were covered with gang graffiti and where he now grew 2 marijuana plants right outside the shed door. The gulf between Reggie's life and that of his siblings and mother also continued to grow. One of Reggie's older sisters was a bus driver and a choir director at the Missionary Baptist Church. His other sister had just enrolled in college, and Reggie's older brother was a hospital equipment operator. Reggie's brother-in-law had offered him work in his plumbing business, but Reggie wasn't interested. He always drifted back to his gang in the old neighborhood. So it was a huge disappointment to his mom, but not exactly unexpected, when Reggie, at the age of 16, had his first arrest after failing to stop for a police officer, and his second arrest later that same year for getting caught carrying a weapon. A year after that, in 1993, when Reggie was 17, the homicide rate in South Central had skyrocketed to the point where 7 people were being killed there every week. And Reggie was at ground zero for all of that street violence, selling crack at motels along the Figueroa corridor. Running 30 miles north and south through the city,
Figueroa is one of the longest streets in Los Angeles, and today it has the highest arrest rate in the city for prostitution. Finally, in 1995, when Reggie was 19, his gang affiliations and his criminal behavior caught up with him. On August 1st of that year, Reggie was found guilty of fatally shooting a man who was standing outside of a known prostitution house on Figueroa Street. Reggie was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Immediately after the sentence was read, Reggie was placed in a holding cell at a county supermax facility in South Central until a prison transport bus could take him to his new home 3.5 hours away in Imperial County. That new home was Calipatria State Prison, one of the most violent maximum security prisons in the California correctional system. A few days later, on the day Reggie was set to leave for Calipatria, he was thin and lanky, standing at almost 6 feet tall, but weighing just 140 pounds. He was also still wearing the orange jumpsuit he'd been wearing in county jail. Only now, as he climbed onto the prison transport bus in leg and ankle chains, the orange suit marked him as a brand new prisoner, or fresh fish, in the eyes of the level 4 offenders he would be spending the rest of his life with in Calipatria. As the bus headed east from the county jail in Los Angeles and crossed from the heart of the city into the desert, Reggie began to realize just how bad his situation really was. He was not just traveling to a new jail, he was leaving behind everyone and everything he had ever known. About 3 hours later, while looking out the window of the bus, Reggie got his first glimpse of Calipatria Prison off in the distance. Its sprawling 325-acre complex of fences, towers, exercise pens, and 2-story cell blocks sat in the middle of more than 1,200 acres of sandy, desolate no-man's land. As Reggie sat there staring, he suddenly realized he was soaked with sweat, despite the fact that the bus was running its air conditioning on full blast. But Reggie had no idea how comfortable that bus ride was relative to where he was going. In Calipatria Prison, when inmates were sent outside to the asphalt-covered exercise yard, there was almost no shade, and temperatures routinely reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the height of summer, temperatures could reach as high as 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And winters in Calipatria were actually just as bad as the summers, but for the opposite reason. During those months, temperatures would plunge well below freezing at night. As the bus rambled down the road, getting closer and closer to Calipatria, Reggie started to smell the cow manure from the cattle feedlots they were passing by. Reggie bent his head down toward his shackled hands to try to cover his nose, not realizing that there was absolutely no getting away from that smell. It would literally permeate every inch of his new home. Finally, the bus reached the prison. Before entering the prison grounds, the bus had to pass through a heavily guarded and fortified opening in a 13-foot-high electric fence topped with razor wire that outlined the perimeter of the maximum security area of Calipatria. The purpose of this fence, which had enough voltage in it to instantly kill anyone who touched it, was to cut down on prison escapes, and to allow correctional officers, who were outnumbered more than 50 to 1 by prisoners, to move from guarding the perimeter to patrolling the inside of the prison. However, this shift in manpower had done very little to stop the violence inside the prison. There was hardly anyone in California, including Reggie, who hadn't heard news reports about the horrible attack that had happened in Calipatria 3 months earlier. 5 inmates armed with homemade knives stabbed and beat 8 prison guards. None of the guards died, but the incident sent shockwaves through the state. After passing through the perimeter fence, Reggie's bus continued on towards the main prison. As they got closer, Reggie suddenly felt scared and wished the bus ride could go on for a little bit longer so he wouldn't have to get off. The bus finally reached a large garage just off of one of the main buildings. When the bus pulled into the garage, the inmates saw several guards standing around inside, clearly waiting for them. And behind these guards on the wall was a big security door that led into the prison. It actually went into an area called Receiving and Discharge, or R&D. R&D is where new inmates are cataloged, inventoried, and booked into the prison system and their specific prison facility. The bus driver pulled into the designated parking spot in the garage and then came to a complete stop. As the bus engine idled and Reggie and all of the other fresh fish sat anxiously on the bus, One of the guards outside, who was carrying a clipboard, stepped onto the bus and chatted with the driver for a moment. Then the guard turned and faced Reggie and the other men on board and started calling out their names one by one. As he did, each man got up and, with their hands and feet in shackles, they shuffled to the back of the bus, where another guard had opened the back door. There, they would walk down 2 steps to the garage floor. The guard at the back of the bus would then yell at them to make their way over to the door that led into R&D, and there, standing outside that door, were several more guards, all armed with pepper spray and batons, who would pat each man down and search them. After the men were searched, they were motioned to walk through the door into R&D. Although the chains and shackles he was wearing had already drilled into Reggie the fact that his life was now totally changed, he was still not prepared for the shock he felt when he finally stepped through the R&D door and was actually inside the prison. Inside, a guard watched every move Reggie made, and security glass and wire separated Reggie from the men and women who processed his paperwork. What little he had brought with him was about to be inventoried and put into a storage compartment. His only possessions going forward would be the items that prison officials would give him over the next several hours. After stepping into a big windowless room, he was told to take off his clothes, and then a guard with gloves on did the first of hundreds of strip searches that would become a routine part of Reggie's life. Then he was handed his prison-issue clothing and told to get dressed. After he was given his inmate ID card that he would keep with him at all times. Reggie was also given 2 blankets, 2 sheets, a washcloth, a pillowcase, soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. After leaving R&D, Reggie was walked to his cell. In Calipatria, the cell blocks were all 2 stories high, with each cell door facing out toward a common area that the guards patrolled. Unlike what most people imagine when they think of jail cells, these cells did not have bars with lots of openings to look through. The cell walls were concrete, with no windows, and the doors were heavy sheet metal with only 2 small vertical slits that were windows that they could look through out into the common area. Inside of Calipatria, every sound reverberated off of the concrete and metal, meaning it was always noisy and extremely difficult to sleep. As Reggie was led by the guard to his cell, the awful sounds echoing all around of people yelling and banging on things were so distracting and awful that his initial impulse was just to run away to somewhere that was quiet. But, of course, as soon as he had that impulse, he remembered that he'll never be able to do that, ever. This was his reality. When Reggie finally entered his single-person cell and heard the door shut behind him, he felt himself relax just a little bit. He looked around his tiny room and saw a metal sink and a toilet, as well as a bunk bed. And as he looked at the bunk bed, it took him a second to process that there was another person laying on it. Although Calipatria had only opened 3 years earlier in 1992, by the time Reggie arrived, it was already completely overcrowded, which is why single-person cells like this one now held 2 people. The man laying in the bottom bunk stared at Reggie. Reggie looked away. He knew better than to try to be friends with this man. Keeping his head down and making sure he did not touch the lower bunk where his cellmate was still watching him, Reggie awkwardly made up the top bunk with the sheet and blankets he'd been given in R&D. Then, once his bed was made, Reggie walked a few feet over to the metal toilet. He did his business. Then, without a word, he hauled himself up onto the top bunk, where he lay staring at the ceiling in silence. Within the first few weeks of Reggie's arrival, he was given his first lesson in prison survival. He was out in the exercise yard when an older inmate, who was sitting on top of one of the picnic tables, motioned Reggie over. With his elbows propped on his knees, the inmate stared at Reggie as if sizing him up. Then he told Reggie, "You need to find people from your neighborhood, and then you need to join one of the gangs, and if possible, you join the same gang that you ran with on the outside. And don't trust anyone. No one here is your friend. Oh, and make yourself a knife." Reggie thanked him and decided he would take his advice. Inside the prison, Reggie began scanning the inmates for tattoos that signified they were in the Crips, like he had been when he was still a free man. Outside in the yard, Reggie continued to scan the inmates, but he kept to the perimeter where he couldn't be seen as disrespecting anyone or invading their space. Reggie also always carried a homemade knife, which was a toothbrush he had filed down against the concrete. But before Reggie was invited to join a gang, which would offer him protection, he was challenged. Reggie had been making his usual perimeter walk out in the yard when a bigger inmate and a few of his crew walked over and stood in front of Reggie, blocking his path. Then the main guy started muscling Reggie against the fence. Reggie already knew what happened to Fresh Fish, who did not stand up to the first sign of any kind of disrespect or aggression. In fact, he'd seen it over and over again right in his own cell. His cellmate, the same one who had been laying on the bottom bunk when Reggie first arrived, had made the mistake of thinking a few visitors to their cell, men neither of them knew, were there as friends. His cellmate had welcomed them inside and shook hands with them, while Reggie had remained on the top bunk and pretended to be asleep. The men who had come inside immediately grabbed Reggie's cellmate, threw him on the ground, and raped him. When they were done, they left without touching Reggie. Because Reggie's cellmate had not fought back during this first assault, these men would come back many more times, and each time Reggie would be forced to listen to it while he lay still and silent in his top bunk. And like most of the inmate-on-inmate attacks at this prison, the rapes went unreported. Even if a guard took a charge like that seriously, the consequences of snitching on another inmate were much worse than any punishment a correctional guard could deal out. So, out in the yard, as Reggie found himself being muscled against the fence by this big guy, the thought of his cellmate being raped over and over again ran through Reggie's mind. He knew he had to stand up for himself. So Reggie reached into his waistband, he grabbed his homemade knife, and he stabbed the bigger inmate in the side. His aim was not to deliver a wound that would kill, or be so serious that the guards would have to investigate, but to use his weapon for defense and intimidation. From that day forward, while Reggie would never be known as a brawler, he did start to build a reputation as someone who was quick to use his blade, and therefore someone who was not to be messed with. Shortly after this stabbing, Reggie was welcomed into a gang called the 49 Deuce Crips. All the Crips at Calipatria were run by a single man, one of the most violent inmates there, a 200-pound bodybuilder named Eddie Clark, who went by the nickname El Diablo, or the Devil. For El Diablo, Calipatria was not just his home, it was his business. Calipatria was known as a money prison, where drugs were just as pervasive as unchecked violence. Reggie had seen dozens of inmates smuggle crack and heroin around the prison. They would put the drugs inside balloons before inserting them into their bodies, a practice that was extremely risky because the balloon could break or disintegrate once it was inside of them. And all this was part of the drug empire that was ruled by El Diablo. Even the guards recognized his power as Calipatria's shot caller, allowing him to wear a bright orange do-rag wrapped around his head out in the prison yard. Under the general protection of his new gang and their leader, El Diablo, Reggie's life got noticeably better. Not only was he now much more safe at the prison, but being a part of this gang also allowed Reggie to feel somewhat human again, whether it was playing basketball or leaning up against the picnic tables and chatting with fellow gang members. Reggie finally had people around him that he felt like he could trust. But, like everyone else in the Deuce Crips, Reggie did his best not to interact with or attract any attention from El Diablo. Because even though El Diablo was their boss and main protector, they were all afraid of him. El Diablo was only 34 years old, but he had spent 20 of those years behind bars. When he was a juvenile, he beat another teenager to death. When he was an adult, he sexually assaulted an elderly woman and shot her son in the course of robbing their house. In prison, El Diablo was known to turn on people, even his own people, suddenly, viciously, and without warning. The Devil was also connected to prison staff. 2 years after he'd entered prison, he'd fallen in love with one of the corrections officers who oversaw one of the common areas where the Devil spent time. He wrote her an 8-page-long love letter where he told her that, quote, she had 75% of his heart. This was apparently enough for Lisa Finch, who eventually quit her job as a prison guard, married El Diablo, and on her visits to him in Calipatria, she smuggled in PCP-laced cigarettes that he could sell to other inmates. Over the next 4 years, Reggie carved out a relatively safe life for himself in Calipatria. He had managed to fit in with his new gang without upsetting El Diablo. He also managed to avoid making any real enemies outside of his gang. Over the course of those 4 years, Reggie spent much of his time exercising, which added some muscle to his thin frame. He also got several tattoos, including a Ghetto Star prison tattoo on his shoulders, as well as 2 Crips tattoos on his chest and stomach. But despite settling into a routine and starting to feel relatively comfortable, Reggie knew he and everyone else at that prison had a big problem. By 2000, so 5 years into Reggie's prison sentence, El Diablo had gone from just being a very intimidating inmate to being a monster. He would attack virtually anyone for virtually anything. Sometimes all it took was looking at him wrong to get stabbed or beaten or raped. This, of course, made life inside of the prison even more precarious than it already was, as no one knew who El Diablo's next target was going to be. By the fall of 2000, the devil, who was now manufacturing alcohol from the fruit juice he stole from the prison kitchens, had developed such a substance abuse problem that some of his own fellow gang members had tried, unsuccessfully, to stage an intervention. As one inmate recalled, when he was drunk, he was an animal. If he raped you, nobody was going to say anything. But it would turn out that out of all the violent and dangerous offenders in Calipatria who might have stood up to El Diablo and challenged his authority, it would be Reggie, one of the least ruthless inmates, who would finally do it. In late October of that year, an inmate using a slingshot fired a homemade dart at one of the corrections officers out in the prison yard. The dart missed and stuck into a gatepost instead. Immediately, the guards ordered all the inmates to lay on the ground so they could do a weapons check to see who had thrown the dart. The guards didn't discover who had thrown it. However, during their search, they did find a homemade knife inside of a cotton glove laying out in the grass. The guards didn't know this, but the knife belonged to El Diablo's cellmate, who was one of El Diablo's most trusted lieutenants. And so as the guards picked up the knife and began asking whose it was, every inmate in the yard knew El Diablo was going to do something to protect his cellmate from getting caught. El Diablo's eyes traveled across the yard and came to a stop on Reggie Cole, who just happened to be out on work assignment painting one of the prison walls that faced into the yard. Reggie was already serving a life sentence without parole, so adding a weapons charge wouldn't actually change his sentence. Paintbrush in hand, Reggie held his breath, but even with his eyes down, he could feel El Diablo's sudden attention and the silence that filled the yard. Reggie looked up and saw the devil staring right at him. Then El Diablo made a single motion with his hand, pointing to the knife in the corrections officer's hand. He might as well have shouted his order. "You, Reggie, you take the blame for this." For just a moment, Reggie's mind went blank. Then he saw in his mind what would happen if he agreed to do this for the devil. He might be sent to solitary confinement. He might have his family visitation rights revoked. And he would be publicly submitting to another inmate, which would make him look weak. And if he agreed to submit this one time, then he'd likely spend the rest of his life at Calipatria under the thumb of other inmates. So with El Diablo staring at him expectantly, Reggie paused and then said the words that changed the course of his and El Diablo's life. "No, not my knife," Reggie said. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the corrections officers looked stunned. Reggie did not look at El Diablo, but both men knew at that moment Reggie was now a marked man. El Diablo would make sure that Reggie paid the highest price possible for refusing this direct order. Over the next 4 weeks, Reggie expected to be attacked by El Diablo or one of his henchmen at any moment. As the nights grew colder, Reggie would lie in his bunk, sleepless, thinking about his options. The way he saw it, there were only 4 of them. He could submit to El Diablo and do whatever he wanted to pay for his insubordination. He could snitch on El Diablo to the guards. He could kill El Diablo, or he could be killed by El Diablo. Reggie obsessed over these 4 choices. He'd pace around the perimeter of the exercise yard, keeping a very wide berth around El Diablo, weighing out the pros and cons of each action. Finally, Reggie made up his mind. He didn't know exactly how it was going to happen, but he knew he'd be ready when the time was right. It all happened on the morning of November 28th, 2000, roughly 1 month after Reggie had refused to take the blame for the knife. That day, Reggie was walking around the perimeter of the exercise yard when he noticed the devil walking toward him. The devil wasn't even trying to sneak up on Reggie. It seemed like he wanted Reggie to know that he was about to get attacked. Reggie stopped and just watched the devil as he got closer, not really sure what he should do. When the devil was finally right in front of him, he didn't say anything. He just reached out and grabbed Reggie's shoulder with his left hand, and then with his right, he drove a knife into Reggie's side. Not far enough to be a lethal blow, but enough to send a very painful message that Reggie's days were numbered. As he pulled the knife out of Reggie, El Diablo leaned forward and whispered into Reggie's ear, "You are my bitch." And then he chucked the knife onto the grass and casually walked away. Reggie pressed his hand over his wound, he gritted his teeth, and he walked in the opposite direction of El Diablo over towards the fence. There was nothing anyone could do for him. The guards made no sign of having even noticed the attack, and even if they had, Reggie, like other victims of El Diablo's violence, would have lied. About 15 minutes later, a bell sounded, signaling the exercise period was over. The guards and inmates knew the drill. The inmates would line up and be searched for weapons or contraband before they were allowed to re-enter the cell blocks. El Diablo was ahead of Reggie in the line. Reggie, hiding his stab wound under the waistband of his pants, stood there quietly, clutching a 6-inch long knife that he had dug out of its hiding place near the fence just minutes after he had been attacked by El Diablo. A corrections officer ordered El Diablo to turn around while he was still in line and to stretch out his arms so he could be searched. The devil did this, and as he was turned around, he stared menacingly at Reggie. On the devil's right forearm, there was a tattoo of a hand gripping a sword. On his right ribcage was a self-portrait of El Diablo slitting a man's throat. Looking up and finally meeting El Diablo's eyes, Reggie suddenly leapt over the crouched prison guard who was between them searching El Diablo, and Reggie drove the point of his homemade knife directly into the front of El Diablo's throat. El Diablo, still staring at Reggie, but now with a look of terror on his face, staggered backwards and off to the side. The blade had gone straight through his voice box, and blood was now pouring out of that 1-inch hole in the center of his neck. Reggie immediately threw himself to the ground, putting his hands behind his back. As he laid there looking up at the stunned El Diablo, Reggie knew the wound he had just inflicted was fatal. As everyone else in the yard also got down on the ground and guards started firing off their cans of pepper spray, Reggie told one of the nearby guards, "I know what I did. I know what I did." By the time the doctor arrived 30 minutes later, El Diablo was dead. By late that afternoon, Reggie had been placed into solitary confinement. Other inmates may have hated and feared El Diablo, but by killing Calapatria's shot caller, El Diablo's lieutenants would be gunning for Reggie. Not only that, Reggie now faced another murder charge. If he was convicted, the only punishment left was the death penalty. And no one contested the fact that Reggie had committed this murder. There had been dozens of eyewitnesses, including prison guards, who had seen Reggie fatally stab El Diablo. Also, there was security camera footage, and there was Reggie's own confession, one that he never tried to recant. Instead, Reggie actually went on record saying that he felt bad for killing El Diablo because El Diablo was a human being who had a family that was going to hurt when they heard the news. But Reggie also insisted that he murdered El Diablo in self-defense. If a judge accepted this, the first-degree murder charge would be dropped to manslaughter and Reggie would escape the death penalty, but he would still face 10 years in solitary confinement. Both outcomes seemed so grim that even to Reggie, hiring a lawyer and preparing a defense seemed both hopeless and pointless. When Reggie was handed a list of county-approved attorneys, he looked at it, but none of the names meant anything to him. However, it would turn out that Reggie's random choice of a lawyer named Christopher Plord would be the second most important decision of his life, right after his decision to kill El Diablo. Because over the course of the next 3 years, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, dressed in his crumpled suits and peering out from behind his wire-rimmed glasses, would make a huge discovery about Reggie that would change everything. And the way Christopher made that discovery was by digging into the murder case that had landed Reggie in Calipatria in the first place. 6 years before the murder of El Diablo, late on the night of Monday, March 28, 1994, 2 LAPD homicide detectives arrived at the scene of a murder. It was right outside of a known house of prostitution on Figueroa Street, the street in South Central that Reggie used to spend a lot of his time on. The victim was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez Angeles. He was found lying on the ground with a gunshot wound in his back. The police located the prostitution house manager, a pimp named John Jones, who also became their star eyewitness. According to John, who saw the attack from the second-floor window of the house, he said Felipe showed up to the house that night in a car with 2 other men. Felipe had gotten out, he had walked up to the door and knocked loudly. When one of John's staff members had opened the door, Felipe had asked to see a specific prostitute, but he was told she was busy. So Felipe turned around and started walking back toward the car where his other 2 friends were. But before he could get to the car, 3 teenagers, 2 of which had guns, appeared out of the darkness and demanded Felipe give them his money. They also yelled at Felipe's 2 friends who were in the car to do the same thing. But Felipe and his friends didn't speak English and just stood there seeming confused. At which point, the teenagers just started shooting at Felipe and his friends in the car. Felipe got hit in the back as he tried to flee, and his friends, they sped off in the car. The teenagers turned and ran down an alley, but before they disappeared, John said he noticed one of them was limping. John figured in the chaos, this teen had gotten accidentally shot in the leg by his own friend or even by himself potentially. A few weeks after the murder, a tip from police working a different crime altogether would lead those 2 LAPD detectives who arrived at Felipe's murder scene to Reggie Cole and his friend and fellow Crip, Obie Anthony, who were both in jail at the time on charges of suspected carjacking. One of the 2 detectives brought Reggie into an interrogation room, and during the questioning, the detective examined Reggie's legs, and very quickly he found a gunshot wound. Based on the presence of this gunshot wound on Reggie's leg and the eyewitness testimony of the pimp, John Jones, Reggie and Obie were both found guilty of murdering Felipe Angeles, and they both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. But looking at that case 6 years later, with his client, Reggie, in solitary confinement facing yet another murder charge, all Christopher Plord saw were some very big cracks in the LAPD investigation. Over the next 3 years, Christopher unearthed forensic evidence showing that the bullet that killed Felipe had not been fired from street level, but rather from above, maybe even from the roof or from John Jones's own apartment window. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene that matched Reggie's or Obie's, and no witness could ever identify Reggie as the shooter. John Jones himself had retracted his own testimony, saying that he had told the cops what they wanted to hear in exchange for a lighter sentence when it came to his own crime of running a prostitution house. But by far, the most surprising and damning discovery Christopher made about Reggie's case had to do with the wound on Reggie's leg. It was indeed a gunshot wound. However, it was not anywhere near recent. It was the result of an accident that had happened to Reggie when he was 13 years old, 5 years prior to the murder of Felipe Angeles. And when the LAPD detectives saw this wound in the interrogation room, they would have known it could not possibly have happened recently. It was just a big scar. And Reggie clearly wasn't affected by it. He was not limping at all. In addition to the extremely flimsy case against Reggie for that murder charge, another factor that enhanced the likelihood that Reggie was innocent was Reggie's own behavior after getting convicted. In Calipatria, where violence was power and inmates proudly talked about being killers, Reggie was one of the only inmates who insisted he was not a killer, that he was innocent of his crime. And whenever he wasn't in his cell or working or exercising in the yard, he was spending hours in the prison law library researching wrongful convictions. In February 2008, after Reggie had spent 14 years in prison, 8 of those years in solitary confinement, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, took Reggie's original murder case back to court. And this time, the judge decided that Reggie was innocent, that he had been wrongfully convicted. Following that decision, the state prosecutor agreed to drop the capital murder charge against Reggie in the death of El Diablo. Instead, he reduced the charge to 10 years in solitary confinement for manslaughter, agreeing that in killing El Diablo, Reggie had acted in self-defense. By the time that ruling came down, Reggie had already spent 8 years in solitary, which were counted towards his 10-year solitary sentence. So, 2 long years later, on May 15th, 2009, Reggie Cole finished his solitary confinement sentence and walked out of Calipatria State Prison. He was a free man once again. But Reggie was hardly a happy man. Wrongfully imprisoned for a murder he did not commit, Reggie was only cleared and made free again because of a murder he did commit, and this haunts him. After Reggie's friend, Obie Anthony, was also determined to have been wrongfully convicted, he too was released. In October 2012, the city of Los Angeles paid $8.3 million to Obie Anthony, and in January 2017, it paid $5.2 million to Reggie Cole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review.
A young woman named Anna Mariah Wilson, who everyone knew as just Mo, stood in front of a cheering crowd at the end of a long outdoor bike path in Idaho. Mo had just finished a grueling gravel race, which is a cycling race on very difficult terrain. And it was clear to everyone in the crowd who was cheering that not only was Mo one of the best women cyclists in the country, she was actually quickly becoming the face of the sport. Like all the other competitors, Mo was a highly trained athlete and in peak physical condition. But her brute athleticism was offset by a bright smile, her long auburn hair, and a true love for talking to anybody and everybody. And it was this combination of her athletic skill, outgoing personality, and her natural comfort in front of cameras and on social media that made her the perfect ambassador for the growing sport of gravel racing. And on this particular day, at this race in Idaho, there was one person in particular who just couldn't take his eyes off of her. He was already one of the most famous male gravel racers in the world, and when he made his way through the crowd over to Mo, and Mo turned and saw him, she knew who he was, and her face lit up, and she could feel her heart racing a little. Before long, the two top riders were introducing themselves officially to each other and having some nice small talk, not realizing the horrible chain of events this encounter. On October 28, 2021, 25-year-old Mo Wilson climbed up onto her bike, pulled her dark goggles down over her eyes, put her feet on the pedals, and sped off down a dirt path in the West Texas town of Marfa. Mo leaned down a bit over her handlebars and adjusted her bike perfectly to the changing rocky terrain on the path. Pretty soon, she heard the tires of another bike grinding through the dirt and rocks right behind her, and when she turned and saw who it was, she broke out in a huge smile. It was a 34-year-old man named Colin Strickland, who was another rider, who pulled his bike right up alongside her, and the two of them started winding their way down the path together. So Mo and Colin were not just two bike riders out here enjoying a bike ride. They were actually both world-class professional gravel racers. This meant they competed against other cyclists from all over in races that took place on all kinds of different tracks. They would race through deserts, in the mountains, and over long distances down steep wooded paths. And the two of them had come here to Marfa, Texas, because it was home to great desert trails with difficult terrain that made it a perfect training ground for top riders like Mo and Colin. But after riding for a while, Mo looked out at the bright orange and red sunset stretching out across the huge West Texas sky, and she felt happy she'd come to Marfa, but for a reason that had nothing to do with her training. Because Marfa had gained a reputation as this perfect place for a romantic getaway. The small town had become home to upscale restaurants, high-end art galleries, and places to stay where visitors could feel like they were secluded from the rest of the world. And Mo was looking forward to being alone there with Colin. The two of them had met about a month earlier at a major gravel cycling race in Idaho. Colin was already considered one of the top male racers in the world, and he was actually a celebrity in the sport. And Mo was well on her way to becoming his counterpart, but in women's racing. Their shared love and commitment to the sport made it easy for them to get along right away. And so shortly after that race in Idaho, when Mo went home to Vermont and Colin went home to Austin, Texas, they started texting and speaking all the time on the phone. And just a few weeks later, Mo had headed to Austin to visit Colin, and at that point, they became romantically involved. Now, their relationship was still new, and Mo wasn't exactly sure where they stood, but she figured a few days alone together in Marfa would go a long way to bringing the two of them closer together. Out on the path, Mo and Colin kept on riding. And during this ride, each of them made sure to take the time and made the effort to hone specific skills that they needed to work on. As fun as this was, they were still very serious competitors, and they both had dreams of being the best in the sport, so they always had to train seriously. And they also both really wanted to serve as ambassadors for gravel racing, so it would continue to grow all over the world. Mo and Colin eventually finished up their training ride, and then hopped off their bikes and began to stretch. They were both sweaty and a bit worn out, but now they could get all cleaned up and just spend some time together. And later that night, that's exactly what they did. They relaxed and talked in their room,
and everything seemed easy between them. But as they were doing that, Colin got a text message, and Mo could see his whole attitude changed. He tensed up and got this annoyed look on his face and quickly responded to the text. Mo didn't want to press him, but she was pretty sure she knew who had just messaged Colin, because Mo was aware that he had been seeing another woman, Caitlin Armstrong, before the two of them had started talking and texting. Colin said that he and Caitlin had split up, but it was clear to Mo that Caitlin had not gotten over him. After spending a few perfect days in Marfa, Mo tried hard not to worry too much about Caitlin. However, Mo wasn't naive. She didn't just have Caitlin to contend with. She also had the reality that, trying to maintain any kind of serious relationship with Colin was always going to be difficult. She lived in Vermont, and he lived 2,000 miles away in Texas, and in addition to that, they both traveled a ton for gravel racing competitions, and they didn't always compete at the same locations. So this was a big uphill battle from the start. But when it was time to leave Marfa and go their separate ways, Mo hoped that she and Colin had at least started something special enough that maybe could grow into something bigger in the future, even if they couldn't always be together in the same place. And by the time Mo finally got home to Vermont, she was already looking forward to the next time she could see Colin. At about 4:45 p.m. on May 11th, 2022, so a little more than 6 months after Mo's trip to Marfa, Mo wrapped her arms around Colin's waist on the back of his motorcycle as they sped down a road in Austin, Texas. The last 6 months had not gone exactly as Mo had hoped. After leaving Marfa, she and Colin had both been very busy, traveling and competing, like she knew they would be. But through the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, she felt like she and Colin had barely spoken. They texted occasionally, but their conversations really just seemed to be focused on gravel racing and competing. And so Mo began to think that maybe their romantic getaway together in Marfa had just been a one-time affair. But then, about a month ago in April, Mo had begun to hear from Colin a lot more, and he didn't just want to talk about racing. And when Mo had told Colin that she was headed to Austin in May to compete in a race and to spend some time with one of her best friends who lived there, Colin got excited and made it clear he was looking forward to seeing her. So now, on the back of Colin's motorcycle, Mo held on to him a bit tighter as he turned off a main road onto a side street. They whipped through a heavily wooded area, past an artificial lake, and into the parking lot of Deep Eddy Pool, a popular public swimming pool in Austin. Mo and Colin hopped off the motorcycle and went inside. Mo took off her shoes and her cover-up that was over her bathing suit, and she dove right in. And while Mo didn't want to force anything, she was already starting to feel like she and Colin had reconnected here since she'd arrived. So they would spend hours just swimming and talking in the pool, having a great time, and then afterwards they climbed out, got dressed, and then went and got dinner together nearby. A little after 8:30 p.m. that same night, Colin dropped Mo off at her friend's place where she was staying. They said they would see each other at the upcoming race, and then Mo climbed off Colin's motorcycle. She smiled and waved as she walked around the building into the alley. Then she headed up the old wooden staircase that led from the alley to her friend's small second-floor garage apartment. Once inside, Mo checked on her gravel bike that she'd brought with her just to make sure it was ready to go. Once she was satisfied that it was in good shape, she headed to the bathroom to take a shower. But before she could ever turn the water on, she heard the sound of the apartment door opening. About an hour and a half later, so a few minutes before 10 p.m., Mo's friend walked into the apartment and called out for Mo. The friend didn't get a response, and so initially, she thought maybe Mo was still out with Colin. But as she walked further into the apartment, she saw Mo's legs sticking out from the bathroom. And the friend actually smiled, because she knew that sometimes, after a long day of bike riding, Mo liked to stretch out on the cool bathroom floor to recuperate, especially if it was really hot outside, and it had been over 90 degrees Fahrenheit most of that day. So she called Mo's name again, but Mo still didn't say anything. So her friend walked down the hall, and when she got to the bathroom and actually saw Mo, she began to scream, because the bathroom wall and floor were spattered with blood. Mo's friend grabbed her phone and dialed 911, and as soon as she heard the operator, she shouted that her friend was covered in blood and unconscious. The operator said he would send first responders right away, but he also began telling Mo's friend how to perform CPR. And so the friend dropped down and started doing chest compressions on Mo, fighting through tears and begging Mo to wake up, but nothing was working. Within minutes, Mo's friend heard the door open, and a first responder quickly rushed to the bathroom. The friend at this point backed away, and the first responder took over CPR. But it was too late. Mo was pronounced dead at the scene. Late that night, Detective Richard Spittler and Detective Katie Connor of the Austin Police Department walked through the alleyway and up the steps to the second-floor apartment. On their way, they passed by a uniformed police officer who was standing with a young woman who couldn't stop crying. Spittler and Connor passed them and then put on their gloves, stepped inside the apartment, and walked past a few more officers who'd also arrived before them. Spittler and Connor knew that Anna Mariah Wilson, a woman in her 20s, nicknamed Mo, who'd been visiting from out of state, had been pronounced dead at her friend's apartment, but they really didn't know much more than that. But as soon as they stepped into the doorway of the bathroom, they had a pretty good idea about what had happened. Mo had 3 gunshot wounds in her chest, and amidst the blood surrounding her body, they saw 9mm bullet casings. With all the blood on the walls, the floor, and the body, the detectives knew that the forensics team would have plenty of samples to take, and they thought they already had a pretty clear picture of what had happened to Mo. So, they stepped away from the bathroom and just did a sweep of the apartment. It didn't look like the place had been ransacked in any way, and as far as they could tell, it didn't look like this had been a robbery gone wrong, because expensive electronic equipment had been left untouched. But they still didn't want to jump to any conclusions until they talked to the person who actually lived there. So as the forensics team arrived and got to work, Spittler also sent other officers to canvass the apartment complex and the surrounding area. And then once they were dispatched, he and Detective Connor headed downstairs towards the alley. There, they found the woman who was still crying, and it would turn out she was the owner of the apartment and was Mo's friend. Both detectives felt bad for her, and they knew she'd actually performed CPR on her friend to try to revive her. But right now, despite how much trauma this woman had been through, she was still the only direct link they had to the crime scene. She'd found the victim, and she'd made the 911 call. So, as gently as he could, Spittler told Mo's friend that she would have to come with them to the station for questioning. As the night of May 11th turned into the morning of May 12th, Detective Spittler and Connor sat across from Mo's friend inside of an interview room at the station. The woman was still visibly upset, so the detectives did their best to keep her calm and let her know they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened that night. And eventually, Mo's friend began to talk, and she told the detectives that she had found Mo in the bathroom after coming home. And she said that when she had come to her apartment that night, she hadn't heard or seen anything strange outside when she parked her car or when she was walking up the steps. Everything seemed normal. Spittler asked her if she had noticed if anything inside of her apartment appeared to have been stolen. Mo's friend thought about it and then said nothing of hers had been taken. However, Mo's very expensive specialty gravel racing bicycle was gone, and she said there was no way that Mo would have taken it somewhere and just left it, because Mo not only loved that bike, but literally needed it for an upcoming race. The detectives shared a look. They both realized this could mean that Mo's murder had been the result of a robbery gone wrong. But since the expensive bike was the only thing taken, Spittler thought that most likely pointed to someone who would have known Mo was in town and that she'd brought her bike with her. So, Spittler asked if anybody else knew that Mo was staying at the apartment and that she might have brought her bike. And Mo's friend said that actually a bunch of people knew, because Mo was a big-time gravel racer, and a large number of cyclists who knew her were in town to compete at an upcoming race. But Mo's friend did quickly add that the only person she knew Mo had seen that day was a cyclist that Mo had an on-again, off-again relationship with, a guy who was famous in gravel racing circles named Colin Strickland. Several hours later, still on the morning of May 12th, Detective Spittler and several other officers drove towards Colin Strickland's house in Austin. After working through the night, Spittler and Connor had begun to believe that the man Mo had been out with the day before was their only legitimate lead. They'd taken DNA samples from Mo's friend who'd found Mo, and while they weren't willing to write anyone off yet as a suspect, neither detective really believed she was the killer. On top of that, the detectives' early theory that Mo's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong had already taken a significant hit. Because as officers had canvassed the surrounding area, they'd found Mo's missing bike, abandoned in a thick growth of bamboo, less than 70 feet away from the apartment where Mo had been killed. The one other piece of possible evidence they'd found had come from video doorbell footage from an apartment near the crime scene that showed a black Jeep Cherokee with a large bike rack driving towards Mo's friend's place not long before Mo had most likely been killed. But the police couldn't get a clear read on the license plate number or a clear look at the driver. So, while Detective Connor stayed behind at the station and tried to track down the Jeep, Spittler and his team pulled up their cars to Colin Strickland's house. And when Spittler glanced out of his window, he almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't believe his luck. Parked right out in front of the house was a black Jeep Cherokee with a large bike rack, just like the one in the video footage. The sight of the Jeep gave Spittler a rush, and he thought this was almost too good to be true. But he didn't want Colin to panic and do something stupid. And as much as this car made it seem like there was a good chance Spittler had just found his killer, he did not want to rush to judgment. So when Colin opened the door calmly and said he was willing to speak to the police, Spittler played everything very close to the vest. And so he started his interview with the most basic questions he could think of. He asked Colin if he knew a woman who was a professional cyclist named Anna, and Colin said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. And this actually blew Spittler away, because it was such a blatant lie that Spittler easily could have refuted, even if he hadn't already heard from her friend that Colin and Mo had a close relationship. In fact, in less than a day, Spittler and his team had found online references to Colin and Mo being at multiple races across the country at the same time. And it was also clear to Spittler that the world of professional gravel racing was a pretty small one. So there was no logical way that one of the top racers on the men's side never would have come across one of the top racers on the women's side. But Spittler didn't show any of that on his face. Instead, he told Colin the woman in question, Anna, had the last name of Wilson and was a gravel rider. And at this, Colin's face suddenly changed, like he was only just now remembering Mo's given name, Anna. And he said, actually, yeah, I do know her. Then the detective told Colin that, well, Mo had died the night before, and now Colin's expression changed again. He leaned over and just started rubbing his face and neck. Spittler didn't know what to make of this. Colin did look upset, but at the same time, he had just acted like he didn't know who Anna was, as if he literally didn't know that the woman he had been intimate with, Mo, that her actual first name was Anna. I mean, I guess it was possible, but realistically, if you're being intimate with this person, you probably know their real first name. But maybe he forgot, but it was just all very suspicious. So, after a moment, Spittler told Colin they would need to take him to the station for further questioning. Spittler knew he didn't have anything to hold Colin on yet, but he didn't want to risk Colin fleeing, and he needed more time because he wanted to get a search warrant for Colin's house. As they walked outside together, Spittler asked Colin if the black Jeep Cherokee belonged to him, and Colin said no, it belonged to his girlfriend who lived with him, Caitlin Armstrong. So Spittler asked if Colin ever drove it, and Colin laughed and said no, wasn't really his style. He said he liked to drive motorcycles and big diesel trucks. Spittler smiled and nodded like it was no big deal, but deep down he knew that Colin could easily be lying here. I mean, it was just as likely that, he was at Mo's friend's house the night before, driving that Jeep Cherokee. But right now, it was Colin's word against his. After a short drive, Detective Spittler arrived at the station. While the suspect, Colin Strickland, was taken to an interview room, Spittler told his partner, Detective Connor, about how he'd found the black Jeep with the bike rack on it. It was Colin's live-in girlfriend's car, Caitlin Armstrong. And Detective Connor seemed shocked, not because she was surprised about the Jeep, but because she'd also discovered something huge about Caitlin. While she and the rest of the team were searching for the Jeep and, naturally digging into Colin Strickland's background because he was someone who was seeing Mo, they had discovered his and Caitlin's relationship. And a quick search of a police database showed that police had an outstanding arrest warrant for Caitlin. Because years earlier, Caitlin had gone in to get Botox done at a place in town, and she had agreed to pay for it, she got the services done, but then at the end, when she was actually told to cough up the money, $650, she had run out without paying. Spittler could barely contain his excitement, because this meant they could bring Caitlin in and hold her on that warrant, even if they didn't have enough evidence to hold her in Mo's murder case yet. And that just meant they would have more time to look into her possible connection to the murder. Or at the very least, they would have leverage on her. And if she maybe knew something about her boyfriend, Colin Strickland's potential involvement in Mo's murder, she might be more willing to give up that information. As the detectives talked, they found it hard to believe how quickly things were coming together. In the course of just a single day, they'd already moved in on 2 primary suspects. and it really looked like the doorbell camera footage of the Jeep, along with all the ample circumstantial evidence, pointed to one or both of these people. Shortly after that, officers were able to track down Caitlin at work. They brought her into the station, and at that point, the detectives split up. Spittler continued his conversation with Colin that they had started back at the house, while Caitlin was brought to a separate interview room to sit down with Detective Connor. By this point, Caitlin knew about Mo's death, so Detective Connor didn't waste any time. She went right after Caitlin about her Jeep. Connor said they had footage that showed Caitlin's car driving right near Mo's friend's apartment soon before the murder took place. But Caitlin proved to be very calm and cooperative. She didn't deny that she'd been driving in the area where Mo had been murdered, but she said she had nothing to do with Mo's death. Still, she couldn't really provide the detective with any real reason why she had just happened to be right by the apartment at that time. And while Caitlin never lost her cool, Connor did notice a change in her voice and body language when the subject of Mo's relationship with her boyfriend came up. Caitlin started to sound like a jealous girlfriend. She began talking about how she and Colin had broken up for a short period of time, and it was during that time that Colin apparently had begun seeing Mo a little bit, and it just clearly rattled Caitlin. And by the end of the interview, Detective Connor flat out told Caitlin that the evidence did not make things look good for her, and Caitlin just sort of nodded in agreement. And Detective Connor didn't really know what to make of it. Caitlin didn't confess to anything, but also didn't really defend herself. She just kind of accepted that she was being looked at seriously as a suspect in a murder case, and didn't really put up much of a defense. And while the Jeep footage was pretty damning on its own, realistically, it was not clear in the video who was driving. But by this point, Connor believed if she and Spittler could secure even just one more piece of evidence to connect Caitlin to the crime scene, in addition to the Jeep, that would be more than enough to arrest her for Mo's murder. In the days following the interviews with Caitlin and Colin, police did obtain a search warrant for their house. And inside the house, they found 2 9mm pistols, which matched the type of bullet casing found at the crime scene. Now, all they had to do was wait a few days for the ballistics report to come in to see if one or even both of those guns had fired the rounds that killed Mo. On May 14th, so 3 days after Mo's death, the race that she had actually come to Austin to take part in went ahead as scheduled. But the race quickly turned into a kind of memorial for Mo. For the opening portion of the race, the riders all rode slowly and stayed together in a pack, placing their hands on each other's backs, while others openly sobbed on the course. And when the winner on the men's side of the race crossed the finish line, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he took off his helmet and bowed his head. He would later post on Instagram, quote, "A normal victory salute was inappropriate on a day like this." But as riders from all across the country used that race in Austin as a way to honor and celebrate the life of Mo Wilson, a person most of them considered a friend who they loved and respected, there was one rider whose absence seemed to cast a shadow over everything. Colin Strickland, one of the most popular competitors in the world, and someone who people clearly saw had a relationship with Mo, even if it was just a friendly one, had not shown up. And 3 days later, on May 17th, the detectives read over the ballistics report at the station, and as they did, both of their faces lit up. Because it was clear in the report that one of the guns found in Colin and Caitlin's house was the murder weapon. Following that ballistics report, Spittler and Connor felt a mix of excitement and relief. They believed that in less than a week, they had basically cracked Mo Wilson's murder case. They still weren't sure if either Colin or his girlfriend Caitlin had acted alone, or if maybe they had killed Mo together. But they felt confident they now had more than enough evidence to charge them both. The murder weapon had been found in their house, and police had footage of Caitlin's black Jeep driving near Mo's friend's apartment soon before the murder took place. And in addition to that concrete evidence, the detectives had also caught Colin in what appeared to be a lie. When he was first approached about who Anna was, he said he didn't know who she was. But then when they mentioned that her nickname was Mo, Colin was like, "Oh, now I know who it is." But it's like, you were in a relationship with her. You had to know what her first name was. So there was that. And then also the fact that Caitlin, in her interview, seemed very much like a jealous girlfriend whenever Mo came up. And then finally, detectives had conducted interviews of people in the gravel racing community who spoke openly about the potential love triangle between the victim and the two suspects. So, as far as Connor or Spittler were concerned, either one or both of their suspects would soon be going away to prison for a very long time. But before Spittler and Connor were able to wrap up everything and hand the case over to the district attorney, their investigation, which had been incredibly straightforward so far, took a bizarre turn that neither of them saw coming. In late June, about a month after Moe's murder, Austin police got word from a small group of United States Marshals who were working in Costa Rica. The Marshals told the detectives that they were on the trail of a fugitive named Ari Martin, and they believed that Ari was involved in the murder of Moe Wilson. On the morning of Wednesday, June 29, 2022, over a month and a half after Moe's death, U.S. Marshal Amir Perez walked down the street in a small coastal town called Santa Teresa in Costa Rica, dressed in a Hawaiian shirt, like a tourist. Perez and a small band of marshals had been desperately trying to track down the wanted American fugitive named Ari Martin for over a month. They had spent the last week here in this touristy town, with bars and shops and yoga studios. Right now, Perez was holding up his cell phone with a picture of Ari pulled up on the screen, and he was checking the face of every woman that passed by him to look for a resemblance. But he was having a bizarre problem, and that was that a lot of the women he passed looked like Ari Martin. So Ari was an attractive woman, but she was strangely generic looking, with no unique features really at all. And so this made her somewhat forgettable for the people that interacted with her. And it also made it very hard to pick her out of a crowd, because basically in any crowd, there were at least 3 other women who sort of looked like her. But today, Perez was not just canvassing. He was on his way to a specific location, a cheap hostel he was hoping Ari might be staying at. And after a half-a-block walk, he found it. He turned off the sidewalk and walked inside the building. Then, pretending to be a tourist looking to meet someone, he walked through the hostel out onto a back patio where there were several tables and people were sitting and talking and drinking. And sitting at one of these tables, Perez saw a generic-looking woman who was speaking English. Perez started to get excited, and he looked down at the photo on his phone, but he still couldn't quite tell if this woman was actually a match. He needed to get closer to be sure. So Perez approached the table, he smiled, and began speaking in Spanish. And at this point, the generic-looking American looked up and smiled at him. And while the smile was, like the rest of her, sort of unremarkable, Perez saw one marking that none of the other women he'd looked at had possessed. And what it was a bandage across this woman's nose. And at this point, Perez knew he had found Ari Martin. With more help from Costa Rican authorities, Perez and his team would soon get Ari back to America. And in Austin, Texas, Detective Spittler and Connor would get to sit down with Ari. And through their conversation, they would learn exactly what had happened to Moe Wilson, and they would finally be able to close one of the strangest murder cases any of them had ever worked. Based on information provided by the fugitive Ari Martin, evidence found in the United States and Costa Rica, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Moe Wilson on the night she was killed, May 11th, 2022. That night, around 9:15 p.m., the killer walked through the alley and climbed the steps up to the second-floor apartment. The killer thought being in the alley would keep them mostly out of sight, but they still wore all black just to be safe. Even though the sun had set, it was still very hot outside, and the killer could feel sweat dripping down their face. They used their sleeve to wipe their face, then they drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband and opened the door. As slowly and quietly as they could, the killer walked into the apartment and made their way down the hall. At some point, they stopped and looked over at the high-end gravel racing bike leaning up against the wall. Eventually, they kept on moving down the hall, and as they did, they heard something coming from the bathroom. They stopped and looked over at the bathroom door, and they saw light coming out from underneath. Clearly, somebody was in there. At this point, the killer grabbed their gun tightly and took a few more steps until they were stopped right in front of the bathroom door. There, they took a steadying breath, raised their gun, then reached out with their offhand and opened up the door. Inside the bathroom, Moe saw their killer and she screamed, but before Moe could do anything, the killer fired off 2 shots from their pistol.
The bullet struck Mo directly in the chest, and she fell to the floor on her back as blood spattered the walls. The killer walked over and just stood over Mo, staring down for a few seconds, seeing all this blood run from her wounds onto the ground. Then, the killer raised their gun again, aimed it at Mo's chest, and fired for a third time. After that, Mo lay motionless on the bathroom floor. For a few moments, the killer just stood there, staring down at Mo, trying to make sure she really was dead. And when she continued to lay there motionless, the killer felt confident she was. So, they turned around and headed back into the hallway. There, they grabbed Mo's expensive bike that was leaning up against the wall, and with it in hand, they moved as quickly as they could back towards the door. The bike was cumbersome to move, but the killer managed to handle the outside stairs quickly and rushed into the alley with the bike. Then they ran through the darkness to a spot they knew was covered with a thick growth of bamboo. The killer then tossed Mo's bike into the bamboo, hoping it would hide it and convince the police that Mo had been killed for her expensive bike. Once the bike had been ditched, the killer took a deep breath, then ran out of the alley and hopped into the black Jeep Cherokee that was parked nearby. Once in the car, they hit the gas and sped away across town. From the beginning, Mo's murder had seemed pretty straightforward to Spittler and Connor. But it was in the days following the interviews with their main suspects, Colin Strickland and his girlfriend Caitlin Armstrong, that had sent their investigation down a path the detectives never could have predicted. Because before any arrests could be made, the detectives discovered that Mo's killer had actually fled Austin. And it was not until a month later, when the U.S. Marshals conducted their search in Costa Rica for the fugitive Ari Martin, that everything would finally come together. Because when U.S. Marshal Amir Perez found Ari at the hostel in the small coastal town, he knew he was actually looking at Mo's killer, who was none other than Caitlin Armstrong herself. Here's what happened. During Caitlin's interview with Detective Connor, police had wanted to hold Caitlin on the arrest warrant that had been issued when she ran out on a bill for $650, which had been for that Botox treatment. But it would turn out that arrest warrant apparently had listed Caitlin's date of birth incorrectly, and so it was deemed invalid, and Caitlin was released from jail that very day. And in the time between her release and when the police got the ballistics report back from the guns found in Caitlin and Colin's house, Caitlin moved fast. She immediately sold her Jeep and used some of that money to quickly get out of Texas and head north to Newark, New Jersey. She wiped all of her social media accounts, got rid of her cell phone, and then flew from Newark to Costa Rica. And once she'd made it to Costa Rica, she began going by several different pseudonyms before landing on Ari Martin. Once police discovered Caitlin had made a run for it, they were more convinced than ever that she was the killer. But finding her proved to be very difficult. And this was because Caitlin had not just changed her name, she also went ahead and changed her face. She'd gotten plastic surgery to intentionally erase her individuality and make her look like lots of other women. But while the surgery did make her look somewhat generic, it also left her with a bandage over her nose. And on the morning of April 29th, 1963, a woman named Sofia Perez was riding in the passenger seat of her car, her husband Julian was driving, and they were traveling down a narrow city street in Sevilla, Spain. It was a Monday, but Julian, who was the primary breadwinner, he didn't have work that day. And so the couple had decided, since it was such a beautiful spring day as well, that they would get out and go on a nice drive and just spend some time together. And for Sofia, this was like a perfect day. She adored her husband, and she really loved the city of Sevilla. All the people there were so nice and friendly, and it was such a beautiful place that this was shaping up to be really a tremendous day. And so Sofia and her husband, they are all smiles as they continue driving down this road. Sofia, she's looking out, taking in the sights and the sounds, and then at some point, she just has this inclination to pull out her lipstick and, apply her lipstick. And so she reaches down and she grabs her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. She was a very organized person. And she opened it up and she's rifling through it and she finds her lipstick. And then she grabs the rear view mirror and she turns it and she uses it to apply the lipstick. And as she's doing this, she begins asking Julian, hey, what should we do for the rest of the day? Beyond this drive, what else should we do? And as she's sort of half looking at the mirror and half looking at Julian, she sees a blur of motion out in front of the car. And then she turns and she realizes there's someone in the intersection that they're going to hit. It's a guy on a motorcycle. And before she could say anything, Julian is swerving hard to the right to try to avoid this guy. It's like absolute madness. And then the motorcyclist, he tips over and he goes into a slide.
And then Julian and Sophia, they ram off the road onto the sidewalk and smash into this huge pole. And pretty much right away, Sophia, after the car had come to a stop in front of this huge, metal pole, Sophia began like patting herself down to sort of assess the damage, to make sure she was okay. And then she looked over at her husband, Julian, who was sort of doing the same thing, and they realized that, obviously despite the horribleness of this crash, that they were okay. But then their attention turned to the motorcyclist, because even though Julian didn't hit him, they narrowly missed him. He swerved away and they crashed into this pole. Despite that, one of the last things Sophia saw before they swerved is the motorcyclist had tipped over and gone into a skid, so they had no idea if he was okay or not. And so Sophia and Julian, they carefully climbed out of their pretty wrecked vehicle, and again, they stood and kind of checked to make sure they really were okay, because now they're standing for the first time, but, they're okay. And they walked a little ways, across the street to this other sort of side street where the motorcyclist had skidded off to. And right over there, he was standing. The man who was on the motorcycle, he was standing next to his bike. And, obviously his bike had had some damage done to it, but the motorcyclist, he looked unhurt as well. So this was like an enormous, in some ways, stroke of luck. Obviously, it was bad to get into the accident, but all three of them appeared to be okay. And so Sophia and Julian, they walk over to the motorcyclist, and, the three of them were really amicable. I mean, the motorcyclist understood that, accidents happen. Thank goodness nobody was hurt. And just for a few minutes, the three of them just chatted and sort of just talked about how lucky they really were here. And they exchanged information, so they could cover the damages if they needed to of the respective vehicles. And as they're just sitting there having this, relatively calm and just normal conversation here, Sophia looks over at Julian and she realizes, he was basically unhurt, but not entirely unhurt. He had this scratch on his face that was bleeding a fair amount that very likely was from the crash. And even though by no means is this like life-threatening or anything like that, Sophia was not at the moment talking to the motorcyclist. And so she figured she would just go back over to the car and grab her purse, because she's very organized and she has something in that purse for every situation. She figured she very likely had like a bandage or something she could use to clean up her husband's cut. And so she told her husband and the motorcyclist she was gonna go get her purse and go grab a bandage or something. She goes over to the car, which is still smashed up on the side of the road, of course, and there's a little bit of a crowd of people sort of relatively nearby, kind of assessing the scene. She makes her way around towards the passenger side because her purse was still in the car in the passenger seat. And as she was coming around, getting ready to reach through the open door to grab her purse, which was sitting right there on the seat, something happened. Like she got close enough to the car where like suddenly she felt this intense pain all through her body. And then it was like she couldn't even move. And she found herself falling towards the ground, looking up at the sky, and like her muscles are beginning to spasm. And the last thing she saw was her husband and the motorcyclist running over to her. And then to her horror, as she's laying there looking up at them, they too began to sort of seize up and spasm and fall to the ground right next to her. It would turn out that when Julian swerved to avoid that motorcyclist and crashed into that pole, neither he nor Sophia realized that that pole was actually connected to a power line that held up electrical lines carrying a huge amount of electrical voltage. And during the crash, a few of those lines from the pole had been knocked down to the ground and they fell around Sophia and Julian's car. When the couple first got out of the vehicle, they sort of miraculously avoided stepping on those lines. And if they had just stayed over there, with the motorcyclist and just hadn't gone back to the vehicle, they would have been fine. But Sophia, whose purse always had exactly what she needed, was in the car and she wanted to get it and get that bandage. And so when she went back, she stepped on one of those lines and she was electrocuted. And so she's on the ground, she can't move. And her husband and the motorcyclist, they see this happening, they hear it happening, and they run over unaware of the danger. And they too are hit by those electrical lines. They fall to the ground and all three were electrocuted to death. Our second and final story today is called Rock Bottom. On January 11th, 2018, around 10 a.m., 55-year-old Ray Wright sawed through a wooden board inside of his workshop, which was located about 20 minutes outside of Rockland, California. Now, Ray had only just begun his workday, but he was already covered in sawdust. However, he barely noticed, because this was just a normal part of his job as a carpenter, something he absolutely loved. He loved his career. In fact, Ray really just sort of loved everything about his life and sort of how it was going these days. And that had not always been the case. So about 6 years earlier, Ray was in a very different and much worse place in his life. He'd been recently divorced and had started drinking a lot, and he'd spiraled, further and further out of control until one night he'd gotten really drunk and then hopped behind the wheel, and he caused a terrible accident when he crashed head-on into another vehicle. Now, Ray was more or less okay after that crash, but he'd actually severely injured the people in the car that he had hit. And so Ray had been arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison, and he was ordered to pay a huge monetary settlement to the victims of this crash. And so really, this had been like the true rock bottom moment of Ray's life. But by the time Ray actually got out of jail, he was determined to really turn his life around and become a better person. He'd stopped drinking, and he had joined Alcoholics Anonymous, which is a very well-known support group that helps keep people sober. He'd started spending way more time with his 3 kids and also his brother Dean, and he'd been renting this particular workshop that he was in right now to revamp his carpentry business, Ray Wright Design. And then also, in addition to these specific behavioral changes, overall, Ray had made this huge effort to really shift his thinking about the way he approached life. He decided he was going to really try hard to just have a much more positive attitude in general and just try to be happier. He believed it was more of a mindset, and he really was trying hard to stay in that positive, happy mindset. However, despite these wholesale changes in Ray's behavior and his mindset, which were definitely all good, the one thing he was up against that was very difficult to change, since coming out of prison, was his financial situation. I mean, he really just didn't make a whole lot of money. Despite working really hard as a carpenter now, he just didn't make a lot of money. And this really didn't just affect his life. It affected other people's lives as well. Because, he needed to make those huge settlement payments to the victims of the crash, which he intended to do. But so far, he had not made enough money to make those payments, and it was definitely stressing him out. He knew he needed to make those payments, but Ray was sort of determined that he would just continue to work really hard, continue to build up his business, continue to stay positive, stay happy, be a good person, and eventually he was sure to make these payments and everything would be okay. So in essence, Ray still had problems, but he was working really hard to just stay on the straight and narrow and do the right thing. Now, Ray blew some of the sawdust off the board that he had just cut, and he set it aside. And then, as he was about to start on the next thing, he realized one of the tools that he needed was out in his truck. So he walked through the shop's big warehouse-style doors that opened out onto a dirt driveway. So the workshop where Ray worked was in a fairly rural area with only one immediate neighbor who lived in a trailer right next door on the same property. And the person who owned the trailer was a woman named Katie. But, despite there only being Katie next door, there was still a fair amount of people just sort of coming and going around the place, like Katie's friends and Ray's clients. So the area was actually usually pretty lively. But this morning, as he stepped outside onto the driveway, it was pretty quiet. So Ray just made his way out to his truck and grabbed what he needed from inside, and then he turned and began walking back towards the shop. However, before he actually got to the shop, he heard footsteps on the driveway right behind him. 2 days later, Ray's brother Dean drove his car through some back roads as he made his way towards Ray's house in Rockland, California. Dean had just been to Ray's workshop, and now he was making the 20-minute drive back to Ray's home yet again. And the reason he was doing that is because Dean was really worried. He hadn't heard from his brother in 2 days, and neither had Ray's kids or any of Ray's friends. And this was very unusual. Dean, himself talked to Ray every single day. And he also knew that Ray was a very involved and responsive dad who would definitely not just disappear on his kids. And he was also definitely in touch with other friends. I mean, this was just very unusual for Ray. So over the past 48 hours, Dean had been increasingly getting more and more worried about Ray. He had been talking to anyone he could to try to figure out why his brother was just suddenly gone. He'd already gone to Ray's workshop and his house repeatedly, and he hadn't found Ray or any sign of Ray or any sign of where he might have gone. And also Ray's truck was nowhere to be found either. And that was actually particularly concerning because, deep down, Dean was worried that, despite the changes Ray had made in his life to be a better person and to do right by people, he was worried that, maybe Ray had fallen off the wagon and was drinking again. Like maybe that's why he's gone. He's on a bender somewhere. Now, Dean really didn't want to face that reality. That would be devastating for so many reasons, not to mention, if Ray was off drinking somewhere, who knows what trouble he could be in. He could be in a lot of trouble or hurt or something. And so Dean, by this point, 48 hours into his brother's disappearance, he's just doing his best to kind of push down this growing concern that maybe that's what happened. And in fact, it was actually that sort of nagging fear that Dean had kept him from going to the police and reporting Ray missing. There was just this fear that if he did that, it would sort of expose Ray if he was, not doing what he was supposed to be doing. And so by this point, Dean had held off. Now, Dean parked his car outside of Ray's house again, and he got out and, Ray's truck was not back yet. But Dean was determined that he would just go back inside and take another look around to see if maybe he had missed something. Maybe there was some clue as to where, Ray went or what he was up to. So Dean walked up to his brother's front door and he let himself inside. And immediately, Dean stopped because he smelled something. It smelled like marijuana smoke inside the house, which was really, really odd. I mean, one, because the last time he was here, he definitely did not smell marijuana smoke, but more than that, Ray, his brother, had definitely once been a very heavy drinker. That was true. But he had always hated marijuana. He did not smoke marijuana. And so Dean's standing in the doorway trying to make sense of this, when from the other side of the room, he hears somebody shouting at him to leave. And he sees on the other side of the room, this man has suddenly popped up who Dean did not know, who was looking right at him, basically gesturing for Dean to get out of the house. But Dean, he's sort of like, what's going on here? He looks at this guy and he's like, who are you? What are you doing in here? And the guy went very quickly from being sort of demanding to Dean to very spooked, turning and sprinting out the door, out of sight. Within the hour, a police officer with the Rockland Police Department pulled his cruiser up outside of a small one-story home in Rockland and parked. He saw a man waiting outside the garage, and as the officer got out of his car, the man rushed up and introduced himself as Dean, the person who had called 911. Dean explained to the officer that he had just seen an intruder here inside of his brother's home, and that his brother was also missing. And so the officer took down some notes, both about the intruder and also about, Dean's brother's absence and why him being gone for 2 days was really out of character. And so after the officer finished speaking to Dean, he went inside of Ray's house to take a look around and see if, there was any evidence left behind by the intruder to indicate who they were, or if there was any evidence about, where Ray was, and maybe that this intruder had something to do with Ray's absence. But once inside the home, the officer saw there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of mess or violence, so it didn't immediately seem like the intruder had robbed the place or gotten into some kind of physical fight with its owner. But still, the officer left the property and went back to his cruiser and called it in. And so over the next few days, the Rockland Police Department sort of led 2 parallel investigations. There was the investigation into this intruder inside of Ray's home, which really wasn't going very far. They had very little evidence. There was barely a description of this guy from Dean, who did not get a good look at him. And then the other investigation was into Ray's disappearance. And there was definitely some thinking that the intruder and Ray's disappearance could be connected, but as of right now, they didn't know. But with regards to Ray's disappearance, after the police had spoken to Ray's family and friends, they determined that no one had seen or spoken to him since January 11th. That was the first sort of hard date and hard fact that they had. They also checked into Ray's bank account and phone activity, and they learned he hadn't used them since January 11th, when apparently he went missing. But beyond those details, as the weeks went on, really nothing else came in, not about the intruder or about Ray. Then on January 21st, so 10 days after Ray went missing, the Rockland Police Department got their first, big new lead. And that was Ray's truck had been found. He was not in it. It had been found totally abandoned in this apartment complex that was not far from his workshop. A couple of months later, on an afternoon in late March, Rockland Police Sergeant Zach Lewis sat at his desk at the station going over Ray's case file for what he felt like was the millionth time. So, since finding Ray's truck, basically no new leads had come in. And even that, the finding of Ray's truck really had not been the break that the police had really hoped it would be. The truck was basically in decent working condition. The only thing that really stood out was the plates had been taken off of it. But after they searched the truck extensively, they basically didn't find anything. Nothing that gave away what happened to Ray or where he was or, whether or not this intruder had something to do with Ray. It just really didn't go anywhere. So Sergeant Lewis was feeling pretty stuck when it came to this case. And so right now he was just looking through the information they already had on this case to see if maybe he had missed something. However, as he began doing this, another officer ran through the station towards his desk, waving around some sheets of paper. And this officer ran right up to Lewis, and he slammed the papers down on his desk and explained that the California Highway Patrol had just sent a report over because they thought it might contain a lead in Ray's case. And here was the lead. And so Lewis is really excited. He grabs the document, and he sees it's a report. And it's about this van that had gotten in an accident at the end of January, a few miles south of Rockland in Sacramento. The driver of this van had been extremely drunk and was going over 100 miles an hour when he crashed. And somewhat miraculously, nobody got hurt, including the driver. And so the driver, he survives, and now he's facing all these charges of drunk driving and reckless driving. But the reason this report was sent over to Rockland was because the driver was a man named Victor Gray. That's what his license said. So after the crash, the police discovered that the license plate on the van that Victor had been driving was definitely the right license plate. However, the registration stickers that were on the license plates were not the right ones. Basically, Victor or somebody had taken stickers from some other vehicle and put them on this van's plates to give the impression that their vehicle, this van, was registered. But when they tracked those registration stickers, they discovered those stickers actually belonged to Ray Wright's abandoned truck. Now, Rockland's police department knew this was a huge lead, and they could not screw it up. And so they wanted to make sure that they handled, whatever they did next exactly right, and they leveraged whatever resources they could get. So, over the next few weeks, Lewis and his team reached out to the FBI to help them process Victor's van and collect any potential evidence that was associated with Ray's disappearance. And a little over a month later, on May 8th, 2018, Lewis stood with a few of his other officers in a parking lot not far from Rockland, watching as a team of FBI agents searched Victor's van. Now, by this point, they had discovered that this van not only had Ray's registration stickers on it, but also inside of the van was a lot of Ray's stuff. They had found Ray's glasses, which were smashed. They had found Ray's cell phone, which was also smashed. They found his wallet. They found a hat that said Ray Wright design on it. And critically, they found Ray's rain jacket, and it was covered in blood and partially charred, like it had been burned. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious to investigators that Ray was not just missing. He didn't just, go off the wagon and start drinking again and go disappear somewhere. No. He very likely had been killed, and very likely this guy Victor Gray had something to do with it. But the problem was there was no obvious connection between Victor Gray and Ray Wright, they were total strangers. And when they tried to speak to Victor, to interrogate him, to try to get him to open up and explain if he had something to do with this, if he knew who Ray was, Victor was not talking, so that was a total dead end. And so now investigators were just hoping that, whatever evidence they found in this van, that once it was, sent off and analyzed, that hopefully that would sort of maybe begin to explain what actually happened here. Was this just a random robbery gone wrong? Victor was just robbing Ray and it got violent? Or was it something else? Or who knows what? They just didn't know. Now, Lewis watched as the FBI agents wrapped up the search of the van and they began packing things up, so it was clear they had sort of pulled all the evidence they were going to pull. And, Sergeant Lewis and his team, they were about to leave when suddenly one of the FBI agents who was searching the front of the van in the front two seats, he began waving his arm like he had found something. And so Lewis and the others, they go running over and they look inside the van, and this agent is pointing down to the center of the front of this van, basically near the center console. And there was this little space underneath the center console that apparently nobody had looked in yet. And inside of this little space was another cell phone. 5 months later, on an afternoon in October, Lewis pulled his cruiser into the dirt driveway right outside of Ray's workshop. But when Lewis and the other detective that he was with got out of their car, they ran past Ray's workshop and went to the trailer next door, where Lewis knew a woman named Katie Barnard lived. And so Lewis stood back as the other detective knocked on the door of the trailer, and a few seconds later, a very timid-looking woman, Katie, came to the door and she asked what was going on. And when Lewis explained to her why they were there, Katie went from looking timid to looking downright terrified. And she just began to shake, like she clearly understood why they were here. So they took her down to the station, and pretty much as soon as she was sitting inside of an interrogation room and they began asking her questions, Katie just completely broke and told them everything she knew. So ever since Ray got out of prison for that drunk driving accident, he really had been single-mindedly focused on trying to be a better person and not letting his rock bottom moment sort of ruin his life. And he'd done a great job doing that. He'd gotten sober, he'd begun, spending much more time with his family. He was like a very present father now. He was very well liked in the community. However, even though Ray, had good intentions here, the reality was he was just sort of focusing on rebuilding his own life. He wasn't really trying to help other people. Like his post-jail efforts were sort of all about him. And his self-improvement journey had really not been beneficial for everyone, because Ray had really not truly atoned or done right by the person he had hurt the most, one of the victims of his drunk driving accident, a man named Bob Manor. Bob had been absolutely furious with Ray after the accident because the accident had severely injured him, Bob, to the point where Bob had a permanent limp. And then Ray had stopped making those court-mandated settlement payments to Bob. He was supposed to, but he just wasn't making them. And so Bob is like incensed. It's like, how dare you? You hurt me, you hurt my family, and you're not even paying for it. Like, jail isn't enough. And so for Bob, it became like an obsession that he really wanted to get his revenge on Ray. And it just so happened that Bob was not just a guy with a grudge. Bob was a very violent drug dealer as well. So this was a really big deal for him. So basically, after Ray got out of prison, Bob began obsessing over where Ray was. Like, he wanted to literally discover his address so he could physically go and take his revenge, but he couldn't find Ray. He could not find the information. No one was going to give it to him, for this reason exactly. And so he was just furious all the time. He wants to find Ray, but he has no way of knowing where he lives. Then, just by pure happenstance, Bob ends up dating a woman named Katie Barnard, who just so happens to live in the trailer right next door to the shop in Rockland, California, where Ray worked. And, Bob had no idea. He's just over visiting with Katie all the time. And one day he looks out the window, and who does he see walking out of the doors of that shop? Ray Wright. After that, and you have to understand that some of this stuff actually was never fully explained, Bob hired a man named Victor Gray to kidnap Ray for him, because he wasn't going to do it himself. He needed to catch Ray off guard. And so Victor Gray kidnaps Ray, and he apparently brings Ray to Bob so that Bob can exact his revenge on Ray. Now, we don't know exactly what happened once Bob potentially received Ray. We don't know if Ray ever actually made it to Bob, but we do know at some point Victor did kidnap Ray, and there was definitely revenge, on the agenda. But what Bob ultimately failed to do that got him caught and got Victor caught and got this whole thing blown up was he didn't pay Victor for the kidnapping. So the very thing that Bob was so mad about really was like, how dare Ray do this to me and then not pay me? Well, Bob did the same thing to Victor. He didn't pay him. And Victor was also a violent person. He's a convicted felon, and he didn't take that lightly. And so what did he do? He wrote a letter to Bob basically being like, hey, I kidnapped this guy for you, and I handed him to you. Like, I handed him over, and you haven't paid me yet. And then he took pictures of this letter And those pictures were on that phone that was found underneath the center console of Victor Gray's van. Those pictures of this letter are what connected Victor to Bob, and then the connection from Bob to Ray was already known. And then also critically, because Victor hadn't been paid by Bob for this kidnapping, he took the liberty of not only kidnapping Ray, but he went back and stole the registration stickers off of Ray's truck, and he put them on his own van. And then ultimately, it was that led to Victor getting caught and this whole, con being exposed. Now, we actually don't know specifically what happened to Ray Wright. All we know is that he definitely was kidnapped, and that Bob ordered the kidnapping, and that realistically, Bob is a pretty violent guy. Victor's a violent guy. There's blood found all over, Ray's stuff. It seemed pretty apparent that the revenge that was exacted on Ray involved his murder. But Ray's body was never found, and so we don't really know what happened to him. However, using overwhelming circumstantial evidence, both Bob Manor and Victor Gray were both convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and they were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Acasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Both of today's stories are about people who actually achieved their big career ambitions, but at an extremely high cost. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the Follow Button's nasal spray with super glue. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is on the afternoon of June 10th, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham sat in a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio, listening intently as a prosecutor questioned a witness. And with each word that this witness said on the stand, it made the knot in Clement's stomach get tighter and tighter, because this testimony was very bad for Clement's client, an accused murderer named Thomas McGeehan. So the murder that McGeehan was on trial for had happened about 6 months earlier on Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGeehan had stormed into a saloon with a group of men and attacked another man named Tom Myers. And at some point during this attack, a gun went off, and Tom Myers was shot and killed. Now, there were at least 30 witnesses in the saloon at the time, but the whole attack had happened so fast and was so chaotic that no one had seen who did the actual shooting. Despite that, everyone in town immediately decided that McGeehan had done it. However, even Clement had to admit that that was a reasonable assumption. McGeehan and the victim, Tom Myers, had a long-standing feud, and everyone knew they hated each other. Also, McGeehan was a well-known violent criminal who was said to have killed at least 4 other people. So, when Tom Myers got killed, the citizens of Hamilton didn't even wait for a trial. They wanted to hang McGeehan right now. Now, the police had obviously intervened and arrested McGeehan instead, but word had spread all over Ohio about how messy and dramatic this case was. And as a result, the trial itself had become very high profile. Every day, journalists and important people from all over the state came to sit in court and listen to the testimony. And now, all of these important people were watching Clement's defense case get just obliterated by this witness. The witness was one of the men who had been in the saloon at the time of the murder, and he was making a very big claim. He was saying that even though no one in the saloon saw McGeehan fire the gunshot that killed Tom Myers, he must have. Because after the gun went off, this witness saw smoke coming from McGeehan's jacket pocket, like he had been concealing his gun inside his jacket when he had fired it. Clement looked around the courtroom while the witness explained this, and saw that everybody was nodding, like what the witness said made perfect sense. Clement could tell, basically at this point, everybody thought his client was guilty. But Clement? He did not agree. He knew McGeehan's case looked bad,
But Clement was absolutely certain that his client really was innocent. Clement's theory was that the victim, Tom Myers, had shot himself by accident when he pulled out his own gun during the fight to defend himself. Unfortunately for Clement, though, this was 1871, so there was no forensic evidence about gunshots except for some scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt. So the whole entire case was really just based on witness testimony. And of course, this witness was very convincing for the other side. The prosecutor finished up his questioning and then walked back to his seat with a smirk on his face, like he knew what he had just done. They pretty much had just won the case. It was now Clement's turn with the witness, and he really didn't know how it was going to go. But as Clement stood up and crossed the courtroom floor, he felt a calm come over him because he was thinking to himself, I don't have much to lose. I mean, pretty much everybody thinks my client is guilty. And so if he's found guilty, no one's going to be shocked. But, maybe I can find a way to prove he's innocent, and that would be just great. But if I don't, it is what it is. So to be clear, Clement was a very controversial figure in Ohio at this time, which was right after the Civil War. He had been very vocally against the then president, Abraham Lincoln, and his viewpoints had gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states. And then after the war ended, he had returned to his home state of Ohio and had gone back to being an attorney. But he had never really been able to fully rehabilitate his public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people still really hated him for behavior during the war. And so, in essence, Clement knew that pretty much his public profile was not about to change if he lost this case. I mean, basically nothing would change. He's the guy that everybody hates, and his client's the murderer. It is what it is. But if he won, he could recreate himself in the court of public opinion as a sensational criminal defense lawyer who overturned impossible cases. And again, he really believed his client was innocent, so this would be like a two-pronged major victory for Clement. And so Clement stepped up to the witness box and began firing off questions to this witness. By the end of the day, Clement had gotten that witness to admit he hadn't actually seen a physical gun. And eventually, Clement was able to completely destroy the jacket shooting theory when he showed the court that the jacket that McGeehan had been wearing that night, there was no hole anywhere on it. As the week went on and more witnesses took the stand, Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGeehan shot Tom Myers. But he also couldn't find any evidence that proved his client was innocent either. So later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial came to a close, Clement was kind of worried. I mean, he knew that he had not done enough to get his client acquitted, and even though he knew that the likelihood of success here was always going to be slim, he felt like he had begun to make some serious headway, and they could win. Victory felt possible, and it was just slipping out of his hand. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating profusely as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their just brutal closing arguments. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. I mean, he was moments away from giving his own closing arguments, and it was really his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared would do that, especially after, the prosecutor's really just very powerful speech that he was giving right now. And so as the prosecutor very eloquently and beautifully wrapped up his speech, Clement was busy furiously crossing out lines on his speech and rewriting things and trying to make it better, but he just couldn't. So he just sat there, racking his brain on what to say. But as he was sitting there in silence and like the prosecutor has sat down and everybody's waiting for Clement to stand up and deliver his speech here, an idea suddenly hit Clement. It hit him so hard that he actually just dropped his pen. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier, but he suddenly realized there was a way he could prove McGeehan was innocent. It was so obvious. And if he was right, he would go down in history as probably the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. And so Clement, he lunged for his pen again, and he frantically scribbled down what he was thinking. And then a minute later, he heard the judge call his name and tell him, "Come on, it's your turn to speak." And so Clement, he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. And instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he asked the judge to let him do it instead on Monday. The judge was a little apprehensive, but eventually they agreed. And when they did, Clement felt a surge of excitement rush through his body. And after the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of there fast enough. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his His theory he was going to employ on Monday was correct, but he didn't want anybody from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So after dinner, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet streets of Lebanon. He'd spent the last few hours having dinner with some friends, and while he was pretty vague about what he actually planned to do tonight, he did tell them that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was so confident in what he'd uncover tonight doing this test that he was sure his speech on Monday would be like the greatest legal moment in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline and kept increasing his speed until he was basically running. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. And as soon as he got there, he set up for this test he had planned and then ran through it. And after he finished, Clement smiled because he knew he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 p.m., and Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. And so he just kept pacing around and trying to get his thoughts together, but he was just so excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he paced around, he saw his co-counsel, who was another lawyer on the defense team, walk by. So this hotel was sort of like the home base of everyone who was in town for the trial. And so most of the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside and tried to tell him what he'd figured out. But the words just kind of tumbled out, and all he really got across was that the prosecution had it all wrong. But he, Clement, had figured it out. But his co-counsel was just looking at him like he really didn't understand what he was saying. And so at some point, Clement realized he really needed to do a physical demonstration here. He really needed to repeat the test he had just done to actually show the co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So without a whole lot of explanation to his co-counsel, Clement got up, he set up the test, and then he turned and he told his co-counsel to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, during the test, there was a sudden explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers shot himself by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory held weight with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible to do that. So when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do this test by himself for the first time, he took a gun with him, and he basically experimented with ways it could have actually happened by shooting the gun through fabric from different angles and looking at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, the only forensic evidence they had, they could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range, which meant that McGeehan was standing too far away to be the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel, that his discovery went from great to perfect, because completely by accident, he did exactly what Tom Myers had done. He fumbled with the gun and shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so convincing that his client was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last.
The next and final story of today's episode is called
Gloomy Sunday. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, 32-year-old composer Rezo Sharesh sat in his apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He'd been at it for hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he jotted down a new combination of notes, he'd just tear it up and toss it into his trash bin, where there was already a pile of other discarded drafts. So Rezo was used to this kind of messy creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He'd written more than 40 musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few had been really successful. So Rezo knew he had the talent to be a huge star and to change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different iterations and just allowing the messy creative process to take hold and just kind of letting it run its course, Rezo still just could not come up with any new good work. Mainly because he was incredibly stressed out. So at this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and their future because there were really violent political views spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain power, and Rezo, who was Jewish, was worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept Rezo up at night, the more urgent worry he had on a daily basis that was really impeding his creativity was how to literally afford food, because the world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and mass unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad and getting worse. Banks and businesses were closing almost every day, and more than a quarter of the population was unemployed, living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris so he could find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing, Rezo thought that the creative energy there would inspire him to create something beautiful amid all the darkness. But now, Rezo sighed and leaned back to look around the tiny, drafty Parisian apartment of his. He'd been here for months, and his fortunes certainly had not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But, Rezo, he kept leaning back over and trying to write, but it was like immediately he would tear it up, and he was just getting more and more frustrated. Until finally, he just did give up and put his head in his hands and basically said, I can't do this. It seemed like the harder he worked, and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and awful things going on in the world, the worse he felt, and obviously the worse his work was. Like right now, he actually almost felt physically ill from kind of bottling up all these competing terrible feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was doing that, he suddenly decided he just can't do that anymore. He can't continue to keep that stuff in. It was at that moment that Rezo exhaled and let in all the anguish he'd been trying to push away. Sadness and fear and quiet desperation just washed over him and into him, and he didn't fight it anymore. He just suddenly started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of terrible emotion hit him. And when he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, sad melody began to fill the air. And it was so beautiful and so sad that he actually felt like crying as he heard it. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair, and now tears filled his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some air fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk and hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he'd actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own sadness that it almost hurt. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Laszlo Yavor, who rushed right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians in Paris trying to make good art and a name for themselves, but neither of them had really done it yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. And his friend told him that his fiancée had just ended things with him, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry, the men just walked together in silence. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And without even meaning to, Rezo just began whistling the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His eyes welled up and he sort of began to cry, and also he began to sing along, using words from a very sad poem that he had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it, because without even trying, Laszlo's words were perfectly fit for his melody. And so as this sort of impromptu collaboration has begun, the men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they They rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit and work out the rest of the song. And before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. And the song was about someone whose lover had just died and their desire to be reunited with them. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians to play it. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed a few hours ago, was blaring around the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually cried, and others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sound. It was what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was truly affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday, since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and record it. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment and waited for the song to take hold and the money to start pouring in. But that's not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio or see it on any charts or hear it in restaurants or performed in theaters. It was like it really had never existed at all. And this crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because he'd gotten a taste of hope, and it felt even worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life and the state of the world got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong, and as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something to change. Three years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary, walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house, but as he strode down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window. He stopped cold and his heart began to pound, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song, which, as far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in. But it was completely shocking. I mean, someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio? That meant it was being put out on the airwaves and being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there, letting his own notes wash over him for the first time, hearing this out in public. And then when it was done, he just stood there and just absolutely beamed. And after that, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it played at social gatherings, streaming from people's windows, street performers sang it to passerby, and it was even performed at concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of the year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the papers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand, and he noticed that one of the headlines mentioned his song, Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press, so he immediately grabbed a copy and opened it up to read. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach flipped because this was not good press. Actually, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he'd read it wrong. And so he read it again, and again, and again, but each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. Rezo quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. And he saw there were a few other people who were also by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed voices and pointing at that headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. I mean, the Catholic Church weighed in on it, and then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with dread, just like he had been every day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly there was a knock at the door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police, and they wanted him to come down to the station. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves, but at this point he wasn't surprised, because by now he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific mistake. Because it would turn out Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music or its written lyrics or the actual song playing on record players at scenes of suicides. Dozens of people across Hungary, Europe, and the United States, from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths were so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a letter to the general public begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop sales of the song. And Rezo agreed, and eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner Laszlo. And Rezo's partner Laszlo was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing, because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the day he had written this song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate, and the song's popularity was either a coincidence or sort of an unfortunate trigger. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the legacy of his song, even though it did technically live up to his original vision. It did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. And over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates put the death toll in the hundreds, although the numbers are difficult to verify. Rezo never wrote another hit, and in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out the window of his 8th floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday and died 2 days later. Before I wrap this episode up, I want to say that if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideations, or you're just struggling right now, number one, you're not alone. But number two, you really need to talk to someone. Don't hold that stuff in. Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
On September 11th, 2001, 19 men who had been trained by the extremist group Al-Qaeda launched a terrorist attack against the United States of America. The attackers simultaneously hijacked 4 large passenger airplanes with the intention of crashing them into major US landmarks, trying to inflict as much death and destruction as possible. 2 of the planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 of the planes was flown into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and the 4th plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It's believed that 4th plane was on a collision course with the US Capitol building, but some of the passengers on board realized they were being hijacked, and so they rushed the cockpit and tried to overpower the hijackers, and during the struggle, the hijackers intentionally flew the plane into the ground. All told, nearly 3,000 people were killed during this highly coordinated attack, over 400 of which were first responders, like New York firefighters and police and emergency medical technicians. This attack, which is now referred to as just 9/11, was one of the most covered media events of all time. As such, today, when you Google 9/11, you can see and hear the attack as it happened almost minute by minute. But the footage is so overwhelming and apocalyptic and surreal that unless you were literally there on 9/11 or knew someone who was there, at the end of it, after you're done consuming all of this footage, it feels like you just watched a really distressing movie, not you just watched an actual terrorist attack. And so today, I'm going to share a first-hand account that will actually take you inside the attacks. And this story will not feel like a movie. It will feel very raw and very real. Full disclosure, before we get into this first-person narrative, I had to make some educated guesses about the physical layout of the inside of the North Tower. Now, it's based on floor plans I was looking at and videos and pictures and testimonials, but there are certain details that I'm just not 100% on. However, these are very small details that will not detract from the story, even if they're inaccurate. I have gone way out of my way to make sure that the story I tell you is as close to the actual. On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, 30-year-old Michael Wright hopped into a crowded elevator and pressed the number 81. Michael was an account executive for a telecommunications company that operated out of New York's famous World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was located in the financial district of Lower Manhattan. It was made up of 7 different buildings. Michael's building was one of the 2 identical, massive 110-story tall skyscrapers that were collectively called the Twin Towers, and then separately they were called the North Tower and the South Tower. Michael's company was in the North Tower. Once the elevator reached floor 81, the doors opened up and Michael squeezed his way out of the car, and right ahead of him, on the wall right in front of him, he would have seen 3 other elevator doors, and then on the wall behind him, there would have been another 3 elevator doors, one of which he just exited. To his right, there was just a wall, and then to his left was a set of glass doors that fed out into this big hallway that wrapped all the way around the building. Now, this hallway, there were offices on either side as you went around the 81st floor, but while you were in this hallway, you couldn't actually look out the windows and see this incredible view of New York. The views were only accessible once you were inside of these various office buildings. And so Michael, he gets out of the elevator, he turns left, he goes through those doors, and then he turns right, and he starts walking down this hallway, and then he stops in front of this wooden door on his left. And this was the door to his company, which was called Networks Plus. So he opens that up, and right in front of him is this huge open office space with all these cubicles. And even though it was quite early, dozens of his coworkers were already there with their headsets on, and they're chatting and clicking away on their computers. But Michael was not in a rush. He had a morning routine, and he was not about to break it now. And so he just strolled into the room, he said hi to a couple people, and he walked as if he was going towards the very back of the office, towards the windows, but just before he reached the windows, he found his cubicle on the right, and so he dropped his bag next to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he just kept on walking, he turned right, and he went down this corridor, and then he turned right, and he was facing this cafeteria. And the cafeteria for the company, it was really just this small room with a couple of tables and chairs. There was a fridge, there was a coffee machine. It was really just kind of a lounge area. So he went in there and he grabbed a paper cup, he filled it with coffee, and then he grabbed a bran muffin that was on a community tray. And then he left the cafeteria and went back to his desk and he sat down. And when he sat down, it was 7:45 a.m. And so he didn't immediately turn on his computer and throw his headset on and just dive into work. Instead, he just kind of enjoyed his coffee, enjoyed his bran muffin, and thought about what he was going to do that day. Typically on Tuesdays, Michael would go out and see clients and he would make some sales calls. And so Michael was just kind of sitting there getting his head right for the day. And then after he finished his breakfast, he threw on his headset, he powered up his computer, he checked his email, he started calling around to different clients to set up meetings for later that day. And then around 8:40 a.m., Michael realized he had to go to the bathroom. And so Michael took off his headset, he stood up, he turned around, he left his cubicle, and then instead of walking deeper into the office towards the windows in the cafeteria, he turned left and started walking back towards the main door that fed into his office. So he gets to this door, he opens it up, he steps out into the main hallway, and then he turns left and starts walking away from where the elevators are. Those are down to his right. And so he walks maybe 10 or 15 feet down this main hallway before he reaches a door to the men's room, which is on his right. And so he notices on the door, there's this sign that he hadn't seen before that said, "Please keep the bathroom clean." So he reads the sign, doesn't think much of it, pushes the door open, and when he gets in there, there's a couple of his male colleagues that are kind of yucking it up in the corner, and they're actually laughing about the sign that was on the bathroom door. Bank of America had just recently moved into the 81st floor, so now Michael and his company were sharing this floor with Bank of America, and Bank of America had put that sign on the bathroom door. And so the guys were saying, "Oh, so you come into our space, and the first day you're here, you're telling us we're dirty?" And so Michael, he kind of laughed along with them because once you put it in context, it did seem kind of passive aggressive. At 8:46 a.m., Michael turned away from this group of laughing guys and began walking over to the urinals on the wall. But before he even got to the urinals, suddenly the building jolted hard to one side. Now, the Twin Towers were built to withstand very heavy winds, and so the way they were constructed to do that was they would flex several inches in any direction at any time. But this was not several inches, this was several feet. And it was so violent and so sudden that the marble on the walls actually cracked and fell off. And the guys in the bathroom, most of them lost their balance and fell to the ground. And the one guy who was inside of a stall, he comes running out, he bursts the door open, he's buttoning his pants up, and he's screaming, "What was that?" Michael, after standing back up, began thinking to himself, did I hear a sound? Was there an explosion? What was that? It must have been a gas main explosion. What else could that have possibly been? There was just nothing else he could think of that would account for that big of a shift. But there was just no time to sit there and dwell on how this happened because the alarms in the building started going off. And so Michael and the other guys that were in there, they just left the bathroom to go out to the hallway to see what was going on. And when Michael got out there, he looked left down the main hallway past his office, all the way down to the elevators. And all the way down there, he could see there was clearly fire spitting out of the elevator lobby area. And so before Michael could even process that there was this fire and what he was going to do about it, he heard screaming, a woman screaming behind him. The women's bathroom was right next to the men's bathroom. And so Michael and a couple of the other guys who had been in the bathroom with him, they go running into the women's room, and there was this stall, this bathroom stall in the women's room that had been kind of bent over. And it would turn out during the shift in the building, the door jamb on one of the stalls had folded over, kind of locking it in place. And there was a woman on the other side of the stall. There was a woman in the stall. And so that was the woman who was screaming. And so the men, they get in there, they start kicking and punching this door, trying to get it open. And finally they do, and they're able to pull this woman out. They go back out into the hallway, and right away, Michael notices there is a cloud of white smoke that is filling the entire hallway. It's towards the top, so they can kind of duck down to avoid the smoke. And so Michael's hunched down, and he looks left down the hallway towards where he knows this fire is, and he sees the fire has gotten much larger, and the flames have jumped into the hallway. It's still pretty far away, but clearly this fire is spreading. And so Michael, he's crouched down and he's watching as people are streaming out of his office down the hall, and everyone's kind of avoiding this fire. They're running up to where Michael and the others have congregated. Michael, who's crouched down, he's still kind of just looking generally towards the fire, almost stunned, when he notices something about the ground. There was this huge crack in the ground that ran from where he was all the way down the hall, all the way to the fire. And then Michael turned around and saw that crack actually continued all the way in the other direction. It looked like the floor had literally broken in half, and it was like the floor was going to fall off the building. And so as Michael is crouched down, just staring at this crack, not really sure what to think about it, he started to listen to what people were saying in the hall. Everyone's beginning to speculate about what caused this fire, what caused the building to shift like that. And a lot of people tended to believe it was a gas main explosion, which is what Michael thought. Other people suggested, maybe it was an earthquake, and some outliers said it could have been a bomb. But little did anybody know what had happened to their building was far worse than anything they could have imagined. A few minutes earlier at 8:46 a.m., as Michael stood in the bathroom kind of yucking it up with the other guys that were in there, American Airlines Flight 11, which was this massive 767 passenger airplane carrying 91 passengers, 5 of which were the hijackers, they slammed into Michael's tower 12 floors above Michael's head. The plane was traveling at about 466 miles per hour when it struck the building. The impact and subsequent explosion immediately killed not only everyone on board the plane, but hundreds of people that were inside of the impact zone, which was between floors 93 and 99. The plane also went right through the building, severing all of the stairwells and the elevator shafts, meaning anyone who was still alive from floors 93 all the way to the top, floor 110, all those people, they didn't have an escape route anymore. So they were trapped, they just didn't know it yet. And to make an already horrible situation even worse, after this plane detonates inside of the North Tower, it sends 9,000 gallons of burning jet fuel down these destroyed elevator shafts. And as this fuel tumbled, it would splash onto many of the floors below, like floor 81. The fuel would kind of splash through the openings to the elevator doors. And once a little bit had landed on that floor, the whole floor would catch on fire. But Michael and the rest of the people on floor 81 were completely oblivious to this. All they knew was there's a fire over there, and so we need to get away from it. But as Michael stood up from this crack and began kind of looking around to see what they were going to do next, he noticed that most of the people, while they were staying calm, were not really running to evacuate. They were just kind of standing around, and the different business managers from different departments were just kind of telling their staff members to stay calm and hold on, let's get our thoughts together. And Michael, who was not panicked, at least not yet, he's looking around thinking, you know what, let's just get off this floor. We need to get off this floor. And so he remembered that a lot of his friends, they would sneak out of the office and they would smoke cigarettes in this one particular emergency stairwell that was close to them. And so Michael just started yelling to the group, hey, we got to go now, we need to leave. There's stairs over there, follow me. And so Michael kind of cut through the crowd, and the crowd was very quick to respond. They kind of followed him, and he opened the door, he goes into the stairwell, and he lets some people go in. And before long, there's a very orderly double file line making their way down this stairwell. Michael remembers after he joined this double file line and began going down the steps, this immediate sense of relief, especially after they got down a couple of flights away from the 81st floor. Because in his mind, and in a lot of other people's minds that were in the stairwell with him, the problem was up there. It was the 81st floor. There was this one fire. It was localized. It would be dealt with. And they're already all the way down here. They'll be out of the building soon. So they got nothing to worry about. And so Michael and the rest of his coworkers just kept making their way down the stairs. It was very slow progress. And sometimes it would come to a complete standstill because other people on lower floors were entering the stairwell and joining in this evacuation. But Michael remembers nobody was freaking out. No one was panicking. There were some people that, were more worked up about it, but there really was this sense of safety, that they were in these stairs and that everything was going fine. And so as they're kind of making their way down, most people were concerned with trying to place a call to their family to just tell them, hey, I'm okay. This crazy thing happened at work today, but, I'm going to be fine. Michael had left his cell phone on his desk, so he didn't have a way to call his family. He got a coworker to give him his phone, and Michael tried dozens of times to reach his wife, Jenny, but when he called her, she didn't pick up, and so eventually he just gave the phone back to his coworker and just continued down the steps. At about 9 a.m., so that would have been about 10 or 12 minutes into this evacuation down the stairs, Michael, who again is in relatively good spirits, he knows there's danger upstairs, but they're safe down here, he makes this kind of off-color joke to lighten the mood in the stairwell. Michael turns to one of his male colleagues and pretends to confess his love to him and tells him, the only reason I'm confessing it to you now is because we're gonna die here anyways. Now, the joke here in Michael's mind was, of course we're not gonna die here. He was intentionally dramatizing the entire situation because they were safe. They were in the stairwell, they were evacuating, the fire was up there, they're down here, everything is fine. And some people thought the joke was kind of funny and they laughed at it. But the guy right ahead of Michael didn't think it was funny, and he turned around and looked at Michael and said, hey man, you gotta keep your humor down in here. So Michael, he did immediately regret telling his joke, but not because he was suddenly scared that this situation was far more dangerous than he was realizing, but because he just felt bad for offending some people. Michael would later reflect on this moment, and he would say he was so naive that even though he had seen the fire and seen the physical damage, that crack on the ground and the marble falling off the wall, that despite all that, it was like he just couldn't fathom that they were actually in any real danger inside of this stairwell. He really thought they were going to be just fine. But of course, as history would show us, Michael was wrong. Around the time that Michael was scolded for his off-color joke, about 200 feet to the south of the tower they were in, another passenger airplane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the south side of the South Tower. All 65 passengers on board, which included the 5 hijackers, were killed instantly. The plane was traveling at about 590 miles an hour when it struck the South Tower, and it hit between floors 77 and 85, killing hundreds of people in the impact site and trapping hundreds more above it. And then just like the North Tower, after this plane detonated inside of the South Tower, it sent thousands of gallons of burning jet fuel down these destroyed elevator shafts, igniting fires on many floors below. Despite being so physically close to this second plane crash, Michael didn't hear it, and apparently no one else in the stairwell did either, or they just didn't recognize it for what it was. And so Michael and the others just continued walking down the stairwell thinking everything was fine. Around 9:30 a.m., so that's about 40 minutes into their evacuation, Michael and the rest of his coworkers reached floor 40, and this was the first time they saw firefighters, New York firefighters, running up the stairs to go fight this fire. And so naturally, Michael and the others asked the firemen if they knew what had caused this fire, what was going on, but the firefighters just said, "Look, we don't know exactly what caused this, but go down, it's safe down there." Michael would remember about seeing these firefighters that they all had a similar look on their face. They had this kind of stoic, just kind of neutral look on their face, very calm, very mission-oriented as they charged up the stairs in all this heavy gear. But years later, as Michael reflected on that situation, he thinks about their faces, and now he believes the look they had on their face was actually fear. And unfortunately, most of the firefighters that ran past Michael and the others and went up to fight that fire in the North Tower, they would all perish. A few minutes later, Michael and the others made it down to floor 30, and right around the time they got there, they heard people behind them, above them from higher floors, yelling for people to get out of the way. And so Michael turned around and looked up, and he saw there were some people carrying other people down the stairs, and they were trying to clear a path to get these injured people down. And so Michael, like everybody else, kind of sucked up against the side of the wall to let these people pass. And when they did, he saw there were 2 injured people. There was one guy whose whole shirt had been burned off of his back, exposing his bare back, and he had burns on the top of his shoulder. And then the other injured person was this woman with severe burns on her face. After they passed, Michael and the people around him kind of got back in line and just kept moving down the stairs, but now they were on edge. Everyone was kind of thinking to themselves, how bad is this fire? Who else got hurt? What actually happened up there? A few minutes later, Michael and his coworkers got down to floor 20, and that's when they saw there was this firefighter yelling to everyone, asking, "Hey, does anybody know CPR? I need volunteers who know CPR." And so Michael, he had been trained in CPR 10 years earlier in college, and while he hadn't done it in a while, he felt confident that push came to shove, he could do it. And so he and another guy that was near him volunteered to be these CPR guys. And so they went over to this firefighter who explained to them, stay right here and be ready to do CPR on anyone that is brought down to you. And if anybody else needs help, I need you to try to help them too. So just basically be here as a resource. And so Michael and the other volunteers say, no problem, and they stay right there. And the firefighter grabs all of his heavy equipment and he charges up the stairs. Over the next 10 minutes, Michael and this other guy did not need to perform CPR. However, they did assist one very heavy man that was having a very hard time breathing. They helped walk him down all the way to the bottom. And then Michael and the other volunteer, they turned around and ran back up to the 20th floor. And as they're running up, they're asking everyone around them, hey, do you need help? Do you need help? But nobody needed any help. And so when they got back up to the 20th floor, they were there for a couple more minutes. And then by about 9:50 a.m., there were no more people coming down the stairs. It was just Michael and this other volunteer. And so that's when they decided that it's time to go. And so they bounded down the stairs and they got all the way to the ground floor at about 9:55 a.m. And Michael, he opened the door that led out to the ground floor, which was the plaza level. And what he saw was the worst thing he had ever seen in his life. The people that were located in the North and South Tower above the impact sites would have eventually realized they did not have an escape route. Stairwells were blocked, the elevators didn't work, and so naturally the only way to go was up. And so I'm sure initially there was some speculation amongst these people that a helicopter could come up and get them, or some other way they were going to be rescued. We just need to get higher and higher and higher. But eventually they got to the roof and they got to the upper levels, and there was no rescue. And the fire that was raging below them from the jet fuel, it was growing and creeping higher and higher, and all this black smoke was leaking into the vents of these upper floors. And so the heat and the smoke and the flames, it was driving these people to the absolute top of this building. And eventually these people who were trapped, they would have realized there isn't a rescue that's going to get us in time. We're doomed. And so these poor people, in their final moments, they picked up their phones and they called their loved ones one more time. And so there are all these totally heartbreaking messages of these trapped people calling their family to say how much they love them and how much they're going to miss them. And there are an equal number of messages of these people calling their family to say how scared they are, that they're not ready to die. Eventually, the fire, the heat, the smoke would become so intense that these trapped people would actually go outside the building and would hang on to the windows, dangling hundreds and hundreds of feet off the ground because there was nowhere else to go. And then eventually, when all hope was lost, these mothers and fathers, these wives, these husbands, these sisters, these brothers, these daughters, these sons, these friends, they began jumping off of the tower to their death. Almost all of them jumped alone, but at least one eyewitness saw a couple holding hands. One woman who was falling, in a final act of modesty, held her skirt down. Other people tried to make parachutes out of tablecloths and curtains, but as soon as they jumped, these things were ripped from their hands. The fall from the upper floors of both towers took about 10 seconds, and when their bodies hit the ground, they weren't just broken, they were obliterated. And so Michael, when he opens this door, he steps out into this lobby that's at the plaza level, and he turns and he looks at this huge set of windows that look out into this 200-foot long stretch of open pavement that separates the north tower that he is in with the south tower. And scattered all across this stretch of pavement are about 50 different bodies. The majority of these people had jumped. The rest were either people that had fallen out of the tower from the impact of the plane, or they were passengers on board one of the two planes that actually hit the towers. Michael had no way of processing what he was looking at, because as far as he understood, there was just this fire at the top of the tower he was in. How could all these people be out here? What happened to them? And so as he's scanning the absolute horrors outside, he also sees there is blood all over the windows. And that was from the people that had fallen close to the building. And so as he's seeing all this blood and this carnage, he just puts his hand up over his eyes. Like he doesn't want to look at what's going on outside. He just can't possibly process it. And so instead, he and this other guy, they say, okay, let's not go outside, because if we go outside, something could land on us, a person could land on us. We don't know what's going on out there. Let's go down one more level, because there was another set of stairs right ahead of them in the lobby that went down to the shopping mall, and the shopping mall extended outside away from the tower, and there was street access maybe a half a block away. And so Michael and this other guy he was with, they run over to the stairs, they go down into the shopping mall, and down there it's dark and the sprinklers are going off, and they just start running through this mall trying to get to these stairs that'll bring them back up to the street level. And as they're going, they run into another group of people that are doing the same thing. And one of the people that was with this group was the same woman who had been trapped up in the bathroom on Michael's floor. And so Michael put his arm around her and was just kind of being comforting, and they start walking together. And Michael realized she was very shaken up by the bodies she had seen outside. And even though Michael was very shaken up by it too, he comforted her and said, we got to keep going. We got to keep going. And so the two of them just kept on going until they see up ahead, there's an emergency worker with a glow stick kind of waving people to go towards the stairs, get up onto the street, get out of here, evacuate as quickly as possible. And so Michael and this woman, they run right past the emergency worker. They're not even asking any questions at this point. They just want to get away from whatever it is that's going on. And so they get to the base of the stairs when Michael hears this really loud cracking sound coming from somewhere outside. And so Michael and this woman, they run up the stairs, they get out to the street, and outside it's totally chaos. There's people running around everywhere. There are papers all over the ground and other office furnishings. There are things on fire, and Michael just instinctively looks to his right. He looks down the road because that's generally where he thought he heard that really loud cracking sound coming from. And so he found himself looking at the Millennium Hotel, which is this beautiful hotel on the other side of the road from where he was standing a little ways down to the right. And the windows of the front of the Millennium Hotel are like mirrors. They're very reflective. and he found himself just looking at the reflection on the Millennium Hotel, and he noticed it was reflecting the South Tower. And the South Tower was basically across the street from the Millennium Hotel, basically a half block to the right of where Michael and this woman were. And as he's staring at this reflection of the South Tower, he suddenly realizes what that loud cracking sound was. It was the sound of the South Tower, which was still full of hundreds and hundreds of people collapsing. And so Michael is watching this South Tower collapse through this reflection on the front of the Millennium Hotel. He snaps out of it and turns, and he and the woman just run back down into the mall as fast as they can. They can hear this unbelievably loud sound of thousands and thousands of tons of just metal crashing down almost directly on top of them. And Michael makes it to the bottom of the stairs in the mall and just leaps onto his stomach and covers his head. And he's yelling his wife and his son's name because that's all he can think about. And then suddenly everything goes black. And at the same time, suddenly his mouth, his ears, his nose, everything is just packed with what felt like sand, when in reality it was this white dust that was made from the collapse of the South Tower. And it was made up of pulverized concrete and asbestos and other very toxic chemicals. So as all these building materials are falling down into the mall, also there was this rush of this white dust. And so Michael is just laying there, he can barely breathe, and he's hearing all these big pieces of metal come smashing down all around him, and he's getting ready mentally to just die at any moment. But after a few agonizing seconds, the sounds of the falling materials from the South Tower began to cease after the collapse was basically done, and suddenly Michael began to hear the sound of other people crying and moaning. And so Michael suddenly was acutely aware that he had survived the collapse of the South Tower, but now was almost certainly going to die a slow and horrible death trapped underneath all of this debris. And so in total darkness, Michael just began trying to pull his arms and legs out from whatever it was that was on top of him. And amazingly, he got all of his limbs out. And right away, he began trying to pull this soot and this dust out of his nose and his mouth and his ears. And as soon as his mouth was clear, he began vomiting, and then he was trying to catch his breath. But every breath he took in, there was all this smoke in the air, so it was very hard to breathe. And so Michael managed to rip off his shirt, which was already soaked from the sprinklers when they first came in, and he wrapped it around his head so it was a little bit easier to breathe. And so breathing through his shirt, Michael finally composes himself. And then Michael, he's thinking to himself, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now, but I know I need to move. And so he just started crawling. He has no idea where he's going. It is truly pitch black, but he's just kind of low crawling up and down and over things. He doesn't know where he's going. And then there's this miracle. He sees a little ways away from him, a light comes on. He didn't know what this light was, but he's in survival mode. And at this point, light represents hope. And so he just started crawling towards this light, and he managed to go up and over all this debris, and finally he gets to this clearing where this light is, and it turns out the light was a flashlight held by a fireman who had also survived the collapse of the South Tower. And so Michael crawls over right near this guy and realizes he can stand up. There's enough clearance. He stands up and he looks at this fireman who's this big guy with a mustache, and Michael says to him, what are we going to do now? And so this fireman apparently was remarkably composed, and he doesn't really say much to Michael. Instead, he just pulls his axe off his shoulder and kind of gestures for Michael to follow him. And so Michael naturally follows this fireman, and so he leads them over to this wall, and the fireman reaches out and he rubs the wall with his glove, and he rubs away a lot of soot and dirt to reveal a glass window. And so he tells Michael to stand back, and the fireman winds up and he smashes this window. And on the other side of this window is this Borders bookstore. And in the middle of this Borders bookstore is a staircase that goes up to the main floor and out onto the street. And so Michael thanked this fireman and then climbed through this opening into this bookstore. And as he was climbing through, he looked back towards the rubble and he saw there were lots of other people that were crawling out of the rubble and were getting in line to also climb into the bookstore. And so Michael, once he was through, he waited for a few people, and then they together ran to the staircase. They went up to the first floor and they went out to the street. And when they got out there, it was like the apocalypse. There was that white dust over everything, over people, cars, buildings, everything. They could barely see in front of them. And so Michael just reflexively began running away from the towers. And as he's running, he sees there's this woman just standing in the road and she's weeping. And Michael goes up to her and he says, "Are you okay? Can I help you?" And she is totally non-responsive. And so eventually Michael just leaves her and keeps on running. And after a couple of seconds, he sees there's this overturned food cart on the side of the road. So there's no one nearby. He runs over, he gets 2 iced teas out of the cooler. He opens one and pours it over his face to kind of clear his face off. And then he pours some into his mouth to wash his mouth out. And then he just keeps on running. And again, everything around him is just covered in this dust. And And so as he's running, he eventually sees there's this cameraman that's got his camera trained in the direction of the towers. But the cameraman is not using his camera. Instead, he's hunched over his camera and he's just weeping, like he can't even report the news. And so Michael just kept on running, and at some point he heard another very loud cracking sound behind him, but he didn't even turn around. He just kept on running. And it would turn out it was the sound of his tower, the North Tower, collapsing as well. And just like the South Tower, there were hundreds of people inside it when it fell. And so Michael would eventually just continue running until he reached New York University, NYU. That was where his brother was working, and he hoped he would be there so he could tell him that he survived, that he was okay. But when he got to NYU, his brother wasn't there. However, there were staff people there that saw how horrible Michael looked. He was covered head to toe in the dust. He looked crazed. He had blood all over him. And so they took him in, they cleaned him up, and they gave him a phone. And he was able to get in touch with his wife, and he told her that he was okay. And his wife and his entire family, they were convinced he was dead. They had been watching on TV. They had seen the tower collapse. They knew he was up on the 81st floor. And so they really believed he was dead. But unbelievably, he survived. Michael would ultimately make a full physical recovery, although he would have to have several surgeries to remove the 147 pieces of fiberglass that had embedded in his eyes. Because when the tower collapsed and all that dust and soot got pushed into his mouth and his ears and his nose and his eyes, there were little pieces of fiberglass that basically turned into splinters on his eyes. Like most other 9/11 survivors, Michael thinks to himself, why me? Why did I survive when so many other people didn't? But Michael tries not to dwell on that. Instead, he focuses on trying to honor the memories of the people they lost, and he focuses on trying to be the best father to his sons he can possibly be. So that's going to do it, guys. Before you leave, please go into the description and check out the links to the charities I provided. These are extremely highly rated charities that are still providing support to 9/11 victims, their families, and first responders. The ripple effects of this attack are still felt today by lots of people. And so these charities I've identified are a way to support people that really need it. And so I have already donated to all of the charities listed. So I'm telling you, these are incredible organizations. They are worth giving your money to. And so that's going to do it, guys.